Chapter 353. Today is quite different from yesterday. Finally, the elderly man, with grey hair by his temples, took a sip of tea and sighed with a smile. In truth, this is already much better than my previous situation, and it's much better than many of the people here. For instance, he pointed out the window to the tramps huddled in a corner. Klein and Mike looked over and saw a group of cowering tramps lying on the ground in a filthy place that provided shelter from the wind. They were of all sexes and ages. It was possible for them to never wake up again in the coldness of late autumn. It was then that Klein noticed an old woman in her 60s standing by the street. Her dress was old and worn, but she was relatively neat, and her hair was neatly trimmed. The white-haired old lady had the usual tired look of a tramp, but she still persisted in not squeezing together with the group. Instead, she slowly walked by the roadside, occasionally gazing into the coffee shop numbly. She's also a pitiful person. The former tramp who had eaten the leftover black bread also noticed the old lady and sighed. She was said to have led quite a good life in the past. Her husband was a grain merchant and had a very spirited child, but unfortunately, he went bankrupt and her husband and child died not long after. She's different from us, really, and you can tell at a glance. Sigh, she won't be able to hold on much longer, unless she's lucky to be admitted into the workhouse every time. As he listened, Mike's expression changed from quiet to somber. He slowly let out a sigh and said, "I want to interview her. Can you invite her for me? She can eat and drink whatever she wants here." The man wasn't surprised by this request. He merely looked at Klein and Mike separately, as if to say, "The both of you are indeed colleagues." "Yes, I'm sure she would like that." He drank his tea, got up, and walked out of the greasy coffee shop. Not long after, the elderly woman in her old but tidy dress followed him in. Her pale face slightly lightened thanks to the warmth of the coffee shop. She continued to tremble, as if she wanted to release the coldness in her body, bit by bit, and absorb the relatively high temperature within the coffee shop. Even after she sat down on the chair, it still took her a full minute before she could truly warm up. "You can order whatever you want. This is the reward for accepting this interview," Klein spoke on Mike's behalf. After Mike nodded, the old lady modestly ordered toast, low-quality cream, and coffee. Then she smiled and said, "I heard that one cannot eat greasy food after not having eaten in a while." Very polite, very self-restrained, not like a tramp at all. Klein sighed silently. Before the food arrived, Mike asked casually, "Can you talk about how you became a tramp?" The old lady revealed a look of reminiscence and said with a bitter smile, "My husband was a grain merchant who mainly bought all kinds of grain from domestic farmers, but we rapidly went bankrupt ever since the Grain Act was repealed. He wasn't very young to begin with. After suffering that setback, his body quickly collapsed. Not long after, he passed away. My child, a brilliant young man, had been learning the ropes of doing business from his father. He couldn't suffer the blow, and he ended up jumping into the Tussock River on a moonless night. His first suicide didn't work. He was sent to the magistrate's court, and the police and judges were very impatient, feeling that he was wasting their time. If you want to commit suicide, please do so quietly and successfully. Don't trouble us. Yes, that was probably what they wanted to say, but they found it too direct. My child was put in prison. Not long after, he committed suicide for the second time and succeeded. The old lady spoke very calmly, as though it wasn't something that had happened to her. But for some reason, Klein felt a deep sense of sorrow. Nothing is more lamentable than a dead heart. He suddenly recalled the saying he had heard in his previous life. In this world, suicide was not only prohibited by the churches, but it was a punishable crime. As for the reason, Klein knew very well why. First of all, many suicides were committed by jumping into a river, and without being discovered in time, there was a certain probability of them turning into a water ghost. Second, the suicider often had very abnormal emotions. Thus, under such states, ending their lives was equivalent to a sacrificial offering which could resonate with particular strange and terrifying existences. Thus, their corpses and certain objects that were around after them after their deaths would carry strange curses that harmed others. This was probably where the misfortune cloth puppet behind Tianjin City's Chinese gate came from. Therefore, the 7 Orthodox churches forbade their believers from committing suicide through their own doctrine, and the royal family also promoted the corresponding legislation. Of course, this seemed ridiculous to Klein. How could a suicider be afraid of punishment by the law? While Mike was taking notes, he was about to say something when the owner of the coffee shop brought the food over. "Fill your stomach first, we'll talk later." Mike pointed to the toast. "All right." The old lady ate the food in small bites, appearing very cultured. Having not ordered much, she quickly finished her meal. After reluctantly drinking the last mouthful of coffee, she rubbed her temples and pleaded, "Can I get some sleep first? It's too cold outside." "No problem," Mike answered without hesitation. The old lady thanked him gratefully a few times before she sat down on the chair and curled up into a ball as she fell asleep. Mike looked at the man beside him and said, "You seem to be very familiar with this place. I wish to hire you as our guide. How's 3 soldi for the day?" "I'm sorry, I forgot to ask for your name." The man quickly shook his head and said, No, that is too much. I only earn 1 soldi a day most of the time at the dock. Just call me Old Kohler." "Then, 2 soldi a day." "You deserve it," Mike decided firmly. After witnessing this strange bargaining, Klein blew into a piece of tissue and was about to drink another cup of coffee, when he suddenly sensed that something was wrong. He turned to look at the old lady who was curled up, asleep on the chair. Her face, which had turned ruddy due to the coffee, was pale again. The colors of her aura and moods had vanished. Klein stood up and subconsciously extended his hand to check the old lady's breathing. As Mike and Kohler looked at him in surprise, he said heavily, "She's dead." Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kohler tapped his chest thrice and said with a bitter smile, "I knew she wouldn't be able to hold on for long. Such things happen every day in East Borough. At least she filled her stomach and died in a warm place. I hope it will be the same for me in the future." Klein was silent for a moment before he said, "Kohler, go and get the police." "All right." Kohler tapped his chest thrice once more and ran out of the coffee shop. The boss glanced over but didn't come over. It was as though it wasn't something he needed to concern himself with. After a while, a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform, carrying a baton and revolver, entered the coffee shop. He looked at the dead old lady, asked Mike and Klein a few questions, then he waved his hand and said, "That's all there is to this. The 3 of you can leave after I get someone to collect the corpse." "That's it?" Mike blurted out in surprise. He was obviously not very familiar with East Borough. The policeman sneered. Such incidents happen in large numbers every day in East Borough. He rolled his eyes and looked at Klein and Mike. "You don't look like people from around here. Who are you? What's your identity?" Mike produced his press identification, and Klein said that he was a private detective responsible for protecting him. The policeman's face turned serious as he looked at Klein and said, "I suspect that you're carrying a gun illegally. I want to search your belongings. Please cooperate with me, otherwise, it will be considered a case of resisting arrest." Mike was suddenly worried because he knew that private detectives were usually unlawfully possessing firearms. Klein expressionlessly spread out his hands. "All right." He let the policeman search him, but nothing was found on him. After the old lady's corpse was taken away, the disappointed policeman left. Mike clenched his fist and pounded on the table. A living person just died here, yet, all he cares about is investigating the unlawful possession of firearms. Upon saying this, Mike looked at Klein and asked, puzzled, "You didn't bring a gun?" Klein shook his head, pulled out his holster and revolver from under the table, and said calmly, "As a detective, I have a lot of experience in this area." As a magician, he could place the revolver right in front of someone and make it impossible for the person to notice it. Moreover, since he didn't buy any ordinary bullets, the Beyonder bullets were temporarily left above the gray fog. His revolver was currently empty, but this didn't stop him from shooting with his revolver. All he needed to do was to use his mouth to emulate a bang when he pulled the trigger. Upon seeing this, Old Kohler whispered from the side, "So you're a detective?" Klein pointed at Mike and casually explained, "I was also entrusted with a mission by this gentleman the last time as well." Mike sat there without refuting. After a moment of silence, he said, "Although I've investigated the gangs and witnessed the miserable life of some prostitutes, I'm not familiar with the situation in East Borough. Please help me open my eyes to this place, allowing me to see if there are any problems with this investigation plan." As he spoke, he took a few sheets of paper from the inside pocket of his clothes and spread them out on the coffee shop table. Klein glanced at him. "Interviews with East Borough residents of different ages? That's too troublesome. I think we can divide it according to location. In better apartments, 5 or 6 people squeeze into a one-room apartment. Others stay in the corner of a street that's sheltered from the wind, park benches, bars, and workhouses. In addition, they can be segregated by what time they begin work, and when their rest times are." Mike listened carefully and nodded. "Not a bad idea. What do you think, Kohler?" Old Kohler pinched his nose and said, "I can't read, but I think whatever Mr. Detective said seems all right." Mike thought about it, changed his plan, and said, "Then let's go to a nearby apartment and make a random selection." Chapter 354, Tales of an Adventure, in East Borough. Backlands. East Borough, at an intersection. Mike Joseph saw a number of pitiful-looking children in rags along the street. He wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and planned to head over to give them some pennies. However, his action was stopped by the former tramp, Old Kohler. "They're thieves." "Thieves? What about their parents? Or are they controlled by the gangs?" As a senior journalist, Mike had never been to the East Borough, but he had heard of instances of a few gangs controlling street children to steal and beg. Parents? They either don't have parents, or their parents were once thieves or might still be thieves. "Of course, Mr. Reporter, you're right, many of them are under the control of gangs, and it's said that the gangs will teach them how to steal. For example, they will hang a gentleman's coat on a wall, put a handkerchief in the pocket, and hang a pocket watch on the outside, and through repeated practice, the children will attempt to steal the handkerchief without shaking the pocket watch. This is what I heard from others while at the workhouse when I was homeless." Old Kohler babbled on, "I remember the youngest thief ever caught on this street was only 6 years old." Sigh, 6 years old. He seemed to recall his child who was lost to a disease and couldn't help but take out a cigarette from his pocket. He couldn't bring himself to smoke it, so all he did was take a sniff. 6 years old. Mike was stunned by this number. Klein quietly listened and sighed. "This is East Borough." He looked around, composed himself, and said, "This place is closer to the jungle than to human society. Our interview has to be treated as an adventure. You have to learn how to avoid the territory of dangerous creatures, but you must also avoid those little things that don't seem to be too harmful to you. Well, I'm talking about mosquitoes in the jungle. Mike, if you expose the thickness of your wallet to those kids, then even if you protect it well and don't let them steal it, robbery is a destined outcome during the rest of the adventure. If you dare to resist, then perhaps there will be one more body floating in the Tussock River tomorrow morning." "Mr. Detective, you're absolutely right. There are so many people in East Borough. No one pays notice to the few missing people every day," Old Kohler agreed. Mike listened intently for a few seconds, and after a few seconds of silence, he suddenly said, 35 million. Huh. Because of his cold, Klein's throat was obviously a little hoarse. Mike stepped forward and said, "This is a preliminary estimate of the population count of East Borough. But I know that there's definitely more than that." "That many?" Old Kohler was startled. Although he had experienced the days and nights in East Borough and knew that there were a lot of residents here, he didn't expect there to be this many. "This is several times the population of Tingen City." Klein subconsciously compared it with the place that was most familiar to him. He looked at the intersection a few steps away and asked, "Which way should we go next?" Old Kohler looked up and said, "Definitely not straight. That area is under the control of this Manger gang. They're very vicious and completely unreasonable. If they discover any reporters doing interviews, then they'll definitely beat us up." "This Manger gang? Isn't that the brainless gang that caused me to lose £10,000? He was some kind of executioner. I don't even remember his name." Fortunately, the £10,000 was eventually exchanged for the Seer's corresponding Sequence 7, 6, and 5 potion formulas and the all-black eye, as well as the Intis ambassador's life. I wonder who ended up obtaining the manuscript of the third-generation difference engine. Klein instantly recalled what had happened early last month. "Zmanger gang? The gang that is mainly composed of Highlanders?" Mike asked thoughtfully. "Mr. Reporter, have you heard of them?" Old Kohler asked in surprise. Mike sneered. "They're involved in a lot of cases, and they have some reputation outside East Borough as well. It's said that one of the members was involved in a case of Intis espionage. The person next to you was the person in question, the person who made the report, and also the victim." Klein silently added. "If you gentlemen know about this Manger gang, then why doesn't the police arrest them?" Old Kohler asked from his viewpoint, of someone at the bottom of society. Mike's expression suddenly turned a little awkward, and he coughed twice. "We can only capture those who have committed crimes. There is no evidence for the rest, so we can't arrest them. Moreover, East Borough is so broad, and there are so many people. It would be hard to find anyone who is bent on hiding." As he spoke, he sighed. "It's easy to destroy one's Manger gang, but as long as a Highlander comes to Backland, and if they keep up their strong tradition of being combative while failing to find any other means of earning a living, it's only a matter of time before a new Manger gang appears. This is a complex social issue." Klein pointed to the left and right. "Pick one." Old Kohler looked at the right side of the street. "That's where the Proscrito gang is active. As long as we don't provoke the girls who do business on the streets or in the bars, they won't notice us. Heh, it's still morning, so there shouldn't be any problems. They're still sleeping." The word proscrito meant outlaw in the Lone language, so it could be said that the gang who gave itself such a name was pretty self-aware. Klein and Mike had no objection to this, and with the guide leading the way, they entered the district. The buildings here were relatively better. The streets were less squalid, and the air was filled with the smells of oyster soup, fried fish, ginger beer, and the smell of various food and beverages left behind by street vendors, as well as the fishy smell of fish-related products. While walking here, Klein felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was as if he had returned to Tingen City, to Iron Cross Street, and to the street outside the apartment where he had originally lived in. The only difference was that Backland was closer to the sea and had more traffic. There was a lot more fish. This is a relatively good apartment in this area. Back when I loitered around here, I discovered that the gentlemen and ladies inside are all, quite clean. Old Kohler pointed to a pale yellow 3-story building. As they got closer, they noticed a sign hanging in front of the apartment. It had a picture of a pocket watch, a clock, and a screwdriver, with the words, "Watch Repair." "A watch craftsman lives here." Klein dug up a similar scene from the memory fragments of the original Klein. Back then, Benson, Melissa, and himself had gone to somewhere similar to repair the silver pocket watch which his father had left behind, but despite repairing it several times, it would quickly break. This continued until Melissa fiddled with it and ultimately fully repaired it. It became the most decent thing on Klein's person during that period of time. After Klein's death, the pocket watch, which had both monetary and sentimental value, was not buried with him. It should now belong to Benson, right? I wonder if he will think of me every time he takes out that pocket watch. Klein suddenly blinked and curled the corner of his lips. Probably. Mike wasn't sure. If anything went wrong with his pocket watch, it was usually sent to the original watch store he bought it from. The store would then send it to a repairman or to a craftsman who had partnered with them. As soon as they entered the apartment, they saw a middle-aged man with a messy beard. The gentleman had just come out of the bathroom and was about to return to his room. When he saw the three strangers come in, he hurriedly asked, "Do you want to repair something?" What a coincidence. We actually met the craftsman immediately. Klein was slightly puzzled. Mike took out his pocket watch, smiled, and said, "Yes, my pocket watch has recently not been keeping time well. Can you help me take a look?" He didn't reveal his identity and planned to interview him over some casual chit-chat. The middle-aged man immediately revealed a smile and led them into a two-bedroom apartment which had its door half concealed. He pointed at a chair beside the table and said, "Please wait a moment. I'll go get my tools." "Your tools are not at home?" Mike asked in surprise. The watch craftsman shook his head and laughed. "How is that possible? A set of tools is very expensive. There's no way I can buy them on my own. The only way is to pool everyone's money together to buy 3 or 4 sets, and whoever has business will use them. So, we moved in together. Heh, it's more convenient this way. If we live too far away, we will have to spend extra time and pay for the public carriage to borrow the tools." As he spoke, he left the room and walked to the side. So it isn't a coincidence that we met a watch craftsman. Many of the residents here are of this profession. Klein was suddenly enlightened. Old Kohler looked around the room and enviously said, "Before I fell ill, I lived in such a place as well. My wife would help others sew clothes at home. And my two children, Mike sighed and lowered his voice. I thought watch craftsmen were rich." "Me too," Klein covered his mouth. After a cordial exchange with several of the apartment's residents, Klein and the others once again embarked on their adventure. They had walked about 100 meters when they heard people quarreling along the street. The two women were using all sorts of obscenities against each other, allowing Klein to learn many words he had never heard before. The reason for their argument was that the one on the left accused the woman on the right for making the apartment they lived in dirty and noisy. The woman on the right was scolding the woman on the left, thinking that it had nothing to do with her. After all, no one asked her to recruit guests at night and sleep during the day. "Is that a laundry maid?" Mike asked, frowning slightly. "Yes, I know her. She's a widow, helping people wash their clothes with her 2 daughters, Old Kohler answered certainly. Mike thought for a few seconds and said, "Take me to their place." Old Kohler nodded and led the two of them around the argument before they entered the dilapidated apartment building that was obviously inferior to the one they had just seen. As soon as he arrived outside the laundry maid's room, Klein immediately felt the dampness. In the room hung dresses that were not dried yet. A 17 or 18-year-old girl was squatting in front of a large basin, scrubbing clothes that were covered in bubbles. A girl, that was younger than her, was holding a hot iron wrapped in wet linen cloth. She was carefully ironing the clothes that were done washing and drying. Her careful actions implied that she had been scalded by the steam several times. This was both their workplace and the place where they slept at night. Wet moisture permeated the room and seeped into their bodies. In addition, the stench of all kinds of smells was very distinct. "Doesn't it feel terrible?" Mike pinched his nose. Klein replied in a muffled voice, "I've got a cold." There was no humor in his words. Mike released his fingers, walked into the room, and said to the two surprised girls, "I'm a reporter. I would like to interview a laundry maid." The girl who was scrubbing the clothes shook her head numbly and said, "We have a lot of things to do and cannot afford to waste time." Mike's request for an interview was rejected. He came out with a heavy expression and silently walked back across the street. After taking a look, he pursed his lips and said, "Let's continue." City of Silver. After a thorough examination of Derek Berg, who had experienced hallucinations both visually and auditory, he was brought to the bottom of the spire. This place took in residents who showed signs of losing control, and various methods were used to save them. Walking in the gloomy and creepy corridor, he suddenly felt a strange chill. "Help!" A sharp, shrill voice suddenly sounded from a sealed room. "Help!" The voice came to a sudden halt, and then there was silence. Chapter 355, Outsider This. In the eerie silence, the first thought Derek Berg had when he came back to his senses was to rescue that person. However, the two guards that held him in the middle didn't show any reaction to it, as if everything that had just happened was just his imagination. "Someone is calling out for help," the young Derek informed the two Dawn Paladins. On his left, a tall knight clad in silver armor calmly replied, "Don't be fooled. That's just the normal behavior of those Beyonders who are on the verge of losing control." "Is that so? Maybe he cried out for help because he just isn't willing to give up and lose control and become a monster," Derek thought sorrowfully. Following the change in his mood, the illusory, buzzing sound in his ears became more distinct. After silently taking a few steps forward, the Dawn Paladin from before pointed to a door on the left and said, "You will be staying here for the time being. We will bring you your food and medicine on time." As he spoke, he took out an iron-black bottle. This bottle was constructed from the remnants of the straw-like objects left over from the City of Silver's staple food, black-faced grass. Upon encountering a liquid, it would produce a thin film, thereby achieving a waterproof and sealing effect. Derek took the bottle and gulped it down, feeling a cool sensation slide down his esophagus and into his stomach. His entire being rapidly became quiet. The swaying scenes before his eyes stabilized, and the auditory hallucinations in his ears gradually weakened. Creak. At the sound of the iron door closing and locking, Derek entered his own room. The first thing he saw was a candle flickering with a faint yellow light, and then he made out a low bed, a chair, and a square table. Other than that, there was nothing else. However, the walls, including the door, were all engraved with complicated and mysterious symbols and labels. They seemed to form a complete seal. Derek's emotions were also suppressed by the medicine. He sat down on the bed without the slightest hint of curiosity before lying down. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly heard the sound of someone banging on his door. However, this didn't come from outside his room, but from his neighboring cell. Derek sat up and listened. He heard a sharp, high-pitched wail from the knocking. His hair stood on end as he abruptly stood up, taking an extremely defensive stance. At this moment, thumping sound spread to the metal walls that were separated by two rooms, slowly smashing a protrusion. Derek was about to pray for holy light when the scene before his eyes suddenly lit up. It seemed as if the entire space around him had been moved to the outside world, just in time for the lightning to streak past. The sound of the wall being smashed beside him had vanished, and the bottom of the spire regained its silence. It wasn't an absolute silence. Rather, the sound of light footsteps echoed for a long distance. It only turned silent after the echoes continued on for a long time. Derek was wondering what had happened to the Beyonder in the neighboring cell when someone knocked on the metal wall on the other side. Tack. 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 It was as if someone had bent their finger and was tapping lightly. "Who is it?" Derek asked, raising his voice in slight alarm. The knocking immediately stopped, and after a few seconds, a deep yet rather old voice was faintly transmitted. "So it turns out to be a young fellow. You are?" Seeing that the other person could communicate rationally, Derek leaned against the wall and pressed his ear against the cold metal. The elderly voice chuckled and said, "The person next to you almost lost control several times. He ultimately couldn't be saved today." "He completely lost control?" Derek asked through the metal wall. "So he's become a monster now?" "No, not a monster, but a corpse. He was finished off by the items sealed in here." The elderly voice sighed. "I've been here for 42 years. Yes, those guards told me that they've seen too many similar incidents." Derek was surprised and returned with a question. "You've been here for 42 years? Normally speaking, losing control could be divided into 3 stages. The first stage was warning signs, such as auditory and visual hallucinations. In the second stage, the person's body and mind were already out of control, and from time to time, they would display either terrifying or strange states. As for the third stage, it was a complete breakdown, transforming the rampager into a terrifying monster. The time it took from the second stage to the third stage was rather quick. Perhaps just after discovering the symptoms, one would witness a seemingly ordinary Beyonder turn into a monster which could be found deep in the darkness. In other words, after a second stage Beyonder was sent to the bottom of the spire, they would either be treated with medicine, rituals, and other methods, slowly stabilizing themselves and allowing them to leave within 18 months. Otherwise, they would quickly lose control and be purged. It was impossible for anyone to be locked up for 42 years. As a first stage Beyonder, they would only take between a few days to less than 20 days to eliminate all the symptoms and leave, fully treated. The elderly voice immediately chuckled and said, "That's right, I also didn't expect that I would stay here for 42 years. I don't have any signs of losing control, but they believe I'm rather dangerous and can turn into a monster at any time." Derek frowned slightly and asked curiously, "What happened 42 years ago?" At that time, neither of his parents had been born yet. The elderly voice was silent for a moment before saying, "I was once the captain of an exploration team. We found a destroyed city about half a month away from the City of Silver. This was calculated based on our speed. That city was similar to our City of Silver. It clearly has traces of it being ruled by giants, and it also believed in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Unfortunately, they were destroyed countless years ago." Derek wasn't a stranger to such matters. He immediately guessed, because you encountered some strange incidents there, you were determined to be at risk of losing control? More or less. The elderly voice chuckled. After we explored the core area, we discovered that the city was attempting to change faiths. They created deities that they imagined would save them. However, it was useless. Even the statues of those deities were destroyed and spilled all across the land. At this point, his tone suddenly became heavy. "However, we met a person there. This is the first time in the past 2,000 years that our City of Silver had met someone who didn't belong to our city. Outside City of Silver, in the depths of the endless darkness, there really was someone still alive." Derek subconsciously asked, "You brought him back to the City of Silver?" The elderly voice said after 2 seconds, "Don't you feel shocked? The reason why our City of Silver works so hard to explore the surroundings is to find humans like us. We finally found them 42 years ago. This is indeed rather shocking news, but I often see Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and the others. I often hear of the Lone Kingdom and the 7 Orthodox gods. Isn't it very obvious that there are people outside the City of Silver, with cities and countries?" Derek scratched his head, and without much experience, he pretended to be shocked. I didn't notice this point. This is truly unbelievable. Other than the residents of the City of Silver, there are actually other people." The elderly voice remained silent for a while before saying, "Has the City of Silver's education become so terrible?" Without waiting for Derek to speak, he sighed and said to himself, "We very warily invited that person to the City of Silver as a guest." After some consideration, he agreed. We monitored and escorted him along the way back, but when we had almost arrived at the City of Silver, he suddenly disappeared. We searched everywhere, but we couldn't find him. After we returned to the City of Silver, my team members went crazy, one by one. They lost control. All of them. Not a single one was spared. The 6-member council suspected that we were contaminated by something and that the person was not a human at all, but an evil spirit, a monster. So, they locked me up here, and every so often, they would come over to confirm my condition, but they would never tell me what the problem is, nor would they let me out." Derek exhaled heavily and asked, "Do you remember what that man looked like?" "He looked very ordinary, and nothing about him stood out. He was dressed just like us, and except for me remembering that he was a man, I can't remember what he looked like. However, the elders should be able to use Beyonder means to directly see him from my vague, forgotten memories," the elderly voice recalled for nearly a minute and said with a bit of pain. Derek pressed him, casually, "Did he say what his name was? Did he tell you about his origins?" The elderly voice acknowledged tersely. "He told us that his name was," he paused for a moment before saying, "Amon." Sunday morning, in the factory district. In the past 2 days, Klein and Mike visited many places in East Borough under Old Kohler's guidance. As a result, Mike witnessed 5 or 6 people huddled together in a single room, and that wasn't the worst case he saw. In the poorest areas of East Borough, an ordinary bedroom could accommodate 10 people. The precise division of the right to use the floor and the time of use, day or night, shocked the reporter. Moreover, poverty didn't discriminate between men and women. In those places, people of different genders squeezed in tight spaces without being able to abide by societal norms. Certain incidents which deserved time in court happened all the time. Whether it was men or women, all of them were always facing the threat of violence. Squalid, crowded, smelly, that's the most objective impression. I suspect that every one of them has a serious problem of having parasites. Because the houses were built a long time ago in the most run-down districts, they aren't connected to the sewers. Feces, urine, vomit and other things can be found everywhere. Every house here only has one public bathroom, or worse, every street only has one public toilet. They're extremely busy every day, but they can only barely fill their stomachs without any savings. As long as they're unemployed for a few days, they'll fall into an irredeemable abyss. I don't think they would even be afraid of death if they were given even a little hope. Mike wrote in his investigation manuscript. In addition, the reporter was impressed by the tramps who wandered the streets in the middle of the night, the girls who stood numbly by the street or in the bars, as well as the drinkers who completely let loose with their drinking. They didn't hold back on using violence and didn't consider the future. All of this left a deep impression on this reporter. He grew more and more silent. Chapter 356, Informant Fee cough. Mike Joseph took out his handkerchief, covered his mouth, and coughed several times. The smog in the factory district was thicker than anywhere else. The air was gray with a yellowish tint as though it was floating dust. Occasionally a pungent, suffocating odor that even Mr. Reporter, who was long used to the backland air, could not bear. He turned to Klein, who was also coughing softly. I've always been a huge supporter of the government's establishment of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and the Alkaline Industry Inspector, but only today did I learn that the problem has become so serious. If we don't take effective measures, it may become a tragedy in the future. Klein tried hard to clear his blocked nose. Perhaps the whole of Backland would be shrouded in smog that results in one's vision not exceeding 5 meters, and it's possible that an evil god would descend or be born in such a backdrop, he added silently. Old Kohler didn't quite understand the conversation. He cleared his throat that was filled with thick phlegm and led the reporter and the detective around the watchman and into a lead factory. Most of the workers were women. They were working busily without any protection, and the factory floor was filled with dust. Looking at the tiny particles floating in the air, Klein felt like he was looking at toxic gas. The young ladies without masks were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. For a moment, he felt as though he was back in Tingen, back to the time when he had helped Sir Deweyville deal with the grievance haunting him. He seemed to have already witnessed the future of each and every female worker, some of them with throbbing heads, some with blurred vision, some turning hysterical, some with gums with a blue line, and finally, they either went blind or fell dead. It's like a large-scale, bloody sacrificial ritual. The only difference is that the target is that flashing symbol of money. If the Aurora Order, Rose School of Thought, and other evil sects could make good use of similar situations, just like what Lenevis did, there would be a huge problem. Klein covered his mouth and nose as he quietly watched. Mike Joseph muttered in surprise and anger, "How can this be? How can they be like this?" A while ago, all sorts of newspapers and magazines were focused on the issue of lead poisoning. Why aren't they using any precautionary measures at all? They can't even bear to use a mask. These factory owners are murderers. He truly is a reporter with a sense of righteousness. Even though he isn't young, he's rather stingy, and his acting is pretty outstanding, he still retains his original pure motives. But how is he so aware of lead poisoning? Right, I forgot. I had gotten Sir Deweyville to advertise the dangers of lead poisoning on the newspapers and magazines. It seems like he did it well, but for some people, what does it matter if one or two of the lower-class commoners die? There are plenty of people waiting for jobs. Klein thought with a heavy heart. As a senior journalist, Mike didn't lose his reason. He quietly observed and asked a few workers who had changed shifts, then he left the lead factory. Subsequently, they entered one factory after another, but lost their mood to discuss anything when they saw the squalor of the place and the intensive labor involved. It was almost noon when Klein suddenly discovered that there were a lot of people gathered outside a factory. They were mostly women, and they were excitedly shouting something and were trying to rush in. What happened? Mike asked Old Kohler, puzzled. Old Kohler was also puzzled. I'll go over and ask. He jogged to the outside of the factory and blended into the crowd. It took him several minutes to get back to Klein and Mike. They're going to smash those new machines. Old Kohler took a breath and got to the point. Why? Mike hadn't been in charge of similar news before, and so he didn't know much about the situation. As for Klein, he had an inkling of the reason. Old Kohler pointed to the factory and said, "This is a textile factory. They wish to use the latest textile machines, so the number of people in charge of controlling the machines needed will decrease. It seems like they're going to fire a third of the workers. The female workers want to smash the machines and get their jobs back, or else they'll probably not survive. Perhaps the only choice is for them to become street girls." Mike opened his mouth. From the shape of his mouth, he looked like he was going to say, "Fools," but he didn't say anything in the end. He just looked in silence and didn't even move closer. "Let's go back. I've pretty much finished my investigative interviews." After a long time, Mike sighed. All three of them turned around and began to walk out of the factory district. No one spoke as they walked. As they were about to part, Mike glanced at Klein and spoke in a low voice. "Do you think those women can still find anything else to do if the lead factories who do not provide protection are shut down, or if their bosses are sent to court?" Klein gave it some serious thought and said, "If it's just a few factories, there won't be much of a problem, but some female workers might suffer from the hunger and cold while looking for other jobs, and they would gradually lose their strength because they don't have any savings. It would be a disaster if too many factories are shut down in a short period of time, not to mention the people who lose their jobs after the new textile machines are used. The Backlund factory district alone might have thousands or even tens of thousands of unemployed workers, who have no food or clothing, roaming the streets like zombies. They might lower the conditions of their pay in order to snatch the jobs of others. Who knows how many people in East Borough will lead an even more difficult life or die as a result. It would be a hell-like scene, and even if this world doesn't have beyonder powers, it would still bring about a huge disaster. And now, the various evil gods are lurking in the darkness, waiting." Klein swallowed all the words in his mind. Mike fell silent again, and after paying £10 and 6 soldi, he left the smoke-emitting factory district in a carriage. Klein looked at the carriage ride into the distance but didn't say anything. Back when he was a Nighthawk, he had known and come into contact with the lives of the poor, but the impression left on him wasn't as deep this time. A multidimensional observation revealed a human abyss in front of his eyes. East Borough is truly filled with hidden dangers and tinder-like threats. If one isn't careful, it can be ignited by a cult. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "Kohler, I'd like to ask you to help me keep an eye on the situation in East Borough." "Oh, only when you're not bogged down by work. I'll pay you, giving you the money to build a relationship with the other workers. Every week, we will set a time to meet at the coffee shop from before." Old Kohler's eyes lit up. "No problem." He made no mention of the price, and he fully trusted the good detective. Klein weighed his options and said, "Every time we meet, I'll give you 15 soldi as funds and compensation. If you provide me with information that I'm satisfied with, there will also be an additional 5 soldi as payment." "A pound?" Old Kohler blurted out in shock. In his warmest and happiest days, he was paid only 21 soldi a week, or £1 1 soldi. Yes. Klein nodded. You have to pay attention to your words and actions. Don't be in a hurry to gather information. Maintain a state of speaking less and listening more. Otherwise, you'll be in danger. Informant fees such as these can theoretically be reimbursed, but I'm now a self-sponsored 50p party. Klein sighed as he gave a self-deprecating laugh. Empress Borough, in Miss Audrey's study within Count Hall's luxurious villa. The blonde was listening to Miss Escalante, her psychology teacher, as she occasionally stroked Susie, the big dog who was sitting beside her. With dark hair that went all the way down to her waist, Escalante Ocelica noticed that the dog also seemed to be listening intently. She couldn't help but smile and pause for 2 seconds. Following that, she continued with her introduction. There are currently no completely orthodox theories in the field of psychology. There are several schools of thought, such as psychoanalysis, personality analysis, and behavioral psychology. Of course, research on the mind is not only performed by psychologists and psychiatrists. Many professionals in the field of mysticism are also doing similar work. Among them, the most famous one is, sorry, I've deviated from the curriculum. Let's return to the topic just now and talk about psychoanalysis. Audrey could clearly notice Escalante's intention to guide the topic, therefore, she feigned ignorance and asked curiously, "Teacher, I'd like to know more about the research situation for the mind in the field of mysticism. As you know, I'm very interested in that." Escalante pursed her lips, frowned, and said in embarrassment, "But there are vows of secrecy. I mean, these theories and research are part of the secrets of the mysticism circles. They're privy to those on the inside." "Is that so? Then can I join?" Audrey asked expectantly. "They aren't involved in anything evil, right?" How is that possible?" "It's just a seminar organized by enthusiasts." Escalante diverted the topic after mentioning it. "Let's talk about this later. Let's continue with the lesson first. I've got to know where to draw the line. I'll do it one step at a time. If this is the general trait of the members of the psychology alchemists, then I don't have to worry too much about it being filled with lunatics and perverts like Mr. A." Audrey deliberately put on an expression of reluctance when skipping the subject, but she still politely listened to the theoretical foundations of psychoanalysis. When the class was over, and after sending Escalante off, she returned to the study, carefully closed the heavy wooden door, and said to the huge golden retriever, "Susie, what do you think of her?" "She's not sincere," Susie answered flatly. Then, she tilted her head and said, "However, what she said is very interesting. I think it's even more interesting than meat and biscuits." "Susie, do you wish to be a psychiatrist in the future? Specializing in the treatment of mental illness in animals? For example, that horse which is suspected to suffer from depression at the Glaints." Audrey suddenly fell into deep thought, wondering if she should prepare a special white coat and gold-rimmed glasses for Susie to look a little more professional. Chapter 357, Happenings at the Banquet. When he got back to Mince Street from the factory district, Klein had a simple lunch and took a nap. He didn't wake up until the evening when the sky had darkened. But even so, he still felt exhausted, exhaustion that stemmed from the depths of his heart. After quite some time of being lost in thought, Klein went down to the first floor and lit the gas lamp. He prepared to sit on the sofa and read the day's newspapers, but when he glanced around, he saw an invitation letter on the coffee table. He was stunned for a moment before realizing that it was an invitation letter which Mrs. Stellan Sammer had sent her maidservant to deliver a few days ago. "I almost forgot about this. The disguised matchmaking banquet." Klein put down the invitation letter and walked to the bathroom on the first floor. He used cold water to wash his face, sprucing himself up to look much more energetic. Compared to when he first arrived at Backlund, there was a much thicker black stubble around his lips and under his chin. Although it didn't completely eliminate his scholarly bearing, it made him look more mature and rugged. "Someone who doesn't really know me well wouldn't be able to recognize me in person." Klein exhaled silently, wiped his face clean, and put his gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose. He took a short break, changed into a shirt with a starched collar and a black tailcoat, and then, quite formally, he put on his silk half-top hat and picked up his cane stick and invitation letter before leaving the house for the unit beside his. Amidst the tinkling of the doorbell, he saw Julianne, the maidservant, open the door, and Stellan with her blonde hair coiled up high, and her ears adorned with silver earrings. Klein took off his hat, bowed, and praised politely, "Mrs. Sammer, you are very beautiful today." Although his words were extremely perfunctory, it was true that she was much more beautiful than usual. It appeared that her ability to doll herself up meticulously had experienced a significant breakthrough. It seems like the adultery case made her besties with Ma'am Mary. Besides, Mary is now a tycoon with a wealth of tens of thousands of pounds, and she has been admitted into the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, allowing her to acquaint herself with many people in power. She must have had sufficient experience in the areas of makeup, clothing, accessories, and so on. Klein nodded in understanding. The corners of Stellan's mouth couldn't help but curl up. "These are my new earrings that cost 8 soldi. Lady, you haven't changed in the slightest." Klein smiled and handed his hat, cane, and coat to the maidservant. The fireplace and the pipes in the room brought the warmth of early summer. Many women and young ladies were not dressed that conservatively. Some of their fair arms were exposed, while others bared their creamy chests. "Luke is talking business with some friends. Let me apologize on his behalf." Stellan played her role as the female host to its fullest. "Have your meal first. I'll introduce you to a few well-educated ladies later. Actually, there's no need for that. Just let me eat in peace." Klein smiled. "I can already smell the fragrance of the food." Since there were quite a lot of guests, with over 20 of them, the dinner was in the form of a buffet. Klein took a plate and walked around, and he found that the food was a lot more varied than before. Cold trout, chicken pie, mutton stew with peas, salted breast, curry, roast beef, turkey, beef tongue pastry, ham, salad, and cream cake. The alcohol provided was still champagne and red wine. This suited a carnivore's palate very well. Klein, with his large plate, didn't make conversation with anyone. He hid in a corner and slowly savored the food. It's not as good as the chefs at the Quelag Club. From time to time, he would inwardly make comments on the food. He was about to go for second helpings when he was finally discovered by Stellan Sammer. At the same time, he saw an acquaintance beside the lady. He was none other than lawyer Jürgen with his serious expression. "Right, Jürgen is also a bachelor." Klein smiled and walked over, taking the initiative to ask, "How is Mrs. Doris's recovery?" Jürgen uncomfortably tugged at his bow tie. "She'll be discharged next week." "That's great," Klein sincerely said with mixed emotions. At that moment, Stellan had already brought a few young ladies over and introduced them. "This is Mr. Jürgen Cooper, a senior solicitor, who earns at least £3 a week. He often gets a commission from the cases he handles, and he definitely earns more than £200 a year. Furthermore, he is young and capable. He will most likely become a great lawyer in the future. This is Mr. Sherlock Moriarty, a well-known detective. His income is unstable, but he is paid handsomely for every mission he receives, for example £10 or £50. Lady, isn't this too direct?" Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. Jürgen, who was standing beside him, evidently frowned. Without feeling that she had made a faux pas, Stellan continued the introductions. "Miss Sarah Taylor. Her parents are teachers at a grammar school. Miss Angelina Watson. Her father is a civil servant at the Backlund Police Department." Klein smiled numbly and greeted each lady. After Stellan was done, Jürgen said in a deep voice, "Mrs. Sammer, it's impolite to mention the income of others in front of others." Stellan wasn't mad. Instead, she replied very seriously, "No, it's very important. If you end up liking each other and decide to start a family, then income is essential. Think about it, there must be meat, vegetables, fruits, milk, white bread, butter, cream, and other foods every day. It costs at least £1.05 solely a week on food alone, not to mention the alcohol. In addition, to rent a better house is nearly £1 a week. Yes, there's also the need to purchase water, gas, charcoal, soap, and the like. One still needs to consider transportation expenses. This adds up to about 10 solely. That is just the most fundamental expenses. Are you not bringing your wife to a musical concert or to go watch a play? Don't you need to get new clothes every year? Ladies, I believe that a family must spend at least £30 a year on it in order to be considered to be living a decent life. In addition, there is the salary of the maid, the cost of education for any children, the emergency money that's needed to be set aside for medical treatment, as well as the expenditure of some necessary decorations. Only with an income of more than £200 a year can those needs be met. Only then can a happy family be achieved. Thus, in order to not delay everyone's time or cause any misunderstandings, I believe it is necessary to include this in the introduction. As a lawyer, Jürgen was momentarily unable to provide a rejoinder. Fortunately, he always had a serious and stern expression on his face. How big-hearted. But the basic etiquette is to tell the two parties this information in private, and of course, I know exactly why you're making the introduction straight to their face. Klein smiled. Yes, income is very important. Only with an income of more than £400 a year can one host a dinner at this level. Only with that much can one afford to have his wife be dressed in beautiful dresses and exquisite earrings. Stellan raised her chin slightly as she tried her best to suppress her smile and said, £430. I mean that there must be some savings each year, to prevent any accidents or to have spare cash to invest into stocks or bonds. That was her husband's approximate annual income. After finding a common topic for the two groups of strangers, she left and greeted the other guests. Klein could also clearly sense that Sarah, Angelina, and the other ladies were more interested in lawyer Jürgen. After all, he was a good-looking man, and his job and income were very stable. As for a private detective who might be locked up in the police station at any time, they were not the first choice for middle-class women. Besides, Klein now looked rugged with his beard. It wasn't a surprise that the girls would remain a little apprehensive towards him. After a short casual chat with them, he found an excuse to leave before hiding in a corner and eating while he enjoyed watching Jürgen's awkward and helpless performance. At this moment, it was a wonder where his eloquence as a lawyer had gone to. A few minutes later, the two children of the Sammers ran past Klein while playing. They noticed the gentleman in the corner, stopped, and, with widened eyes, asked curiously, Mr. Moriarty, we heard that you're a detective? Yes. Klein smiled in response. The little girl said innocently, can you tell us about the cases you've cracked? Her twin brother nodded immediately. The cases I cracked? If it doesn't involve wraiths, puppets, or devil dogs, then it's about finding cats or catching an adulterer. There's really nothing suitable for children. Klein thought for a few seconds, then chuckled. All right, this is a story about treasure. An officer who had just returned from East Balham was suddenly murdered. He had mostly forgotten the detective novels he had read in his previous life, so he could only make them up based on a vague impression. The two children didn't care about the irrationality of the plot and listened very seriously, even learning to ask, what happened next? Without realizing it, Klein was a lot more relaxed. When the banquet was almost over, and he was about to leave, he saw that Stellan's face was filled with joy. What is the cause for celebration? Klein casually asked. Stellan raised her head slightly and replied with a reserved smile, Mary has received a luncheon invitation from the Chief Secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, Mr. Hibbert Hall, on Monday. This gentleman is the eldest son of Count Hall, a true nobleman. He has invited all the members of the council and has allowed them to bring 2 or 3 friends with them. Stellan paused. Luke and I were just invited by Mary. Monday afternoon. Dressed to the nines, Stellan Sammer, who was accompanied by her husband Luke Sammer, followed Ma'am Mary to Empress Borough where they saw a large building. Marble statues, pools, fountains, gardens, and lawns reflected themselves in her eyes, making her feel nervous even before she entered the villa. "Luke, does my necklace not match my dress?" she asked her husband as she tilted her head. Luke shook his head and laughed. "Darling, you're too nervous. You don't have to worry about that. The nobles only live in a place that's slightly bigger than ours and eat a little better. We aren't lacking in any way." Stellan nodded when she heard that, as though she had found her confidence. Entering the villa, they saw the gorgeous crystal chandelier, the hall which could accommodate many dancers, and the plates of delicious food. Foie gras, pan-fried dragon-bone fish, baked lobster. Ormer grape wine, misty champagne. It's exactly the same as the magazine's description. Stellan looked at the food with curiosity, thinking that she could have such a meal on a holiday or during New Year's if they scrimped a little. Except for the Ormer wine and the misty champagne, she finally added in her mind. At this moment, her gaze suddenly straightened as she saw a young girl wearing a beige palace dress walking over. The girl had blonde hair and green eyes, and she was abnormally beautiful. She wore a pair of white silk gloves with a pair of small beautiful emerald earrings. She exuded pureness and elegance. "She's just like an angel." Even though she had always been proud of her appearance, Stellan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, and she felt an inexplicable sense of inferiority at that moment. "Hello," she clumsily greeted with the etiquette she had just learned. "Hello," the girl returned the greeting gracefully. After they had passed each other, Stellan accompanied her husband and Mary to meet the distinguished guests and the noble, Mr. Hibbert Hall. After a while, she walked to the balcony by herself, intending to ease her mood. However, she unexpectedly saw the angelic girl from before. She was looking out over the landscape. A large golden retriever obediently sat beside her rose ribbon-rimmed shoes. "It's so cute." Stellan made an attempt to make conversation. The young girl replied with a faint smile, "Let me thank you on Susie's behalf for your praise." As she looked at the duo, Stellan suddenly felt that she should own a similar pet for herself. This was the only way to showcase the Sammer's dignity. She asked in a measured tone, "I heard that the nobles rear a lot of hunting hounds. Is this one of them?" "Yes." The girl whose emerald green eyes looked more enchanting than her earrings' gems lightly nodded. "May I know how much money is needed to buy one?" Stellan asked with a smile. The pure and elegant girl looked down at the huge golden retriever and, without minding the question, answered with a slight smile, £450. Chapter 358, The Sons worry on a luxurious carriage on their way leaving Count Hall's villa. Luke was chatting with Ma'am Mary about the distinguished guests, such as the chairman of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and chief of the National Weather Service, Sir Durr Shaw, or the council member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and president of the Royal Meteorological Society, House of Commons Member of Parliament, Mr. Cave, or Mid-Seashire Medical Health's director in charge and renowned doctor, Mr. Hawksley. They were all influential figures in the government, and the royal family or parliament. And the council's final report would be the most important basis for the planned Anti-Pollution Act and Smoke Emission Act. The Coim Company, which specialized in anthracite and charcoal, was trying to promote and expedite the development, disrupting older but larger competitors from handling the changes. They will certainly not be stingy with their money and will certainly lobby the heavyweight members of Parliament to interfere with our investigation. We must have a clear solution, just like what Mr. Hibbert Hall said. We need to take hold of public opinion and let the newspapers and magazines repeat the horrors of smoke pollution. Luke was a senior manager at Coim, a key assistant to Coim's major shareholder and person in control, Mary, and he himself was quite capable. As they chatted, Luke suddenly noticed that his wife was sitting next to him without saying a word, as if she had lost her soul. "Stellan, what happened?" Luke asked with concern. Stellan jolted back to her senses, forced a smile, and said, "Nothing, I'm just a little tired." "That's right. You must be extremely tense seeing so many important figures. Now, you can finally relax. Exhaustion is a very normal thing. Actually, it's the same for me." Luke smiled. Stellan didn't respond. Instead, she looked out the window towards the park with a lake. Her ears were still ringing with the casual words of the young noble girl from before. £450. A trained hound is priced between £450 and £700. City of Silver, at the bottom of the spire. Derek Berg was locked in a small room, eating food and taking his medicine regularly. As a result, his mental state rapidly improved as his visual and auditory hallucinations were no longer present. I'll be able to leave in a day or two. It's really hard to stay locked up in such an environment for long periods of time. The former captain of the exploration team in the next cell has been locked up for 42 years, yet he's still very lucid and rational. If it were me, I definitely would have gone crazy. However, the explorations and strange monsters that he spoke of are rather attractive and even terrifying. Derek sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the candle that had burned to the end. Before the keepers delivered his next round of food and medicine, he would be placed in true darkness. At that moment, he saw a gray fog spread out as the deep voice of the fool sounded. Prepare for the gathering. Such a change was fleeting. Derek focused his attention and subconsciously counted his heartbeats. However, he soon realized that this wasn't necessary because his current state was one of solitude, and he didn't need to avoid others. Derek, who was no longer counting his heartbeats, quickly thought of a question. Would Mr. Fool's subsequent actions of pulling me above the gray fog be discovered and detected when I'm within the confines of the seal of the mystical object at the bottom of the spire? These were two mystical items that had prevented the complete destruction of the City of Silver in the face of several calamities. In his nervousness and uneasiness, Derek, who had been unable to come to a decision, saw endless dark red lights gushing out of the void and engulf him. The small, enclosed room turned completely silent. Even the sound of his breathing had become extremely weak. Suddenly, the metal wall between Derek and the former exploration team's captain produced a tapping sound. This was the signal the two of them used if they wished to talk to each other. Tack. The other person bent his finger and knocked again. After that, what should have been a third tap, that followed in succession, didn't happen. After a long while, the tapping sound hesitantly rang out again. Following that, both rooms fell into silence, and not a single sound could be heard. After finishing her luncheon, Audrey practiced on the piano before returning to her bedroom while keeping track of the time. As she passed her father's study, she saw that the door was ajar, and a thick stack of papers lay on the table. Those weren't there before. Curious, Audrey slowed down and winked at Susie. As a spectator, Susie often needed only a small hint to understand what her mistress wanted her to do. Of course, she would also occasionally pretend that she didn't understand, only wishing to lie still. Susie, who had received the signal, trotted silently into the study, then stretched out her front paws, placed them on the edge of the table, and stood upright. She quickly glanced at the front page of the stack of documents, returned to Audrey's side, and said in a low voice, "Survey of living conditions at all levels in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district." Audrey, what do those words mean? Survey of living conditions at all levels in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district? Why did Dad suddenly commission this survey? I don't remember ever mentioning anything about this to him. Audrey was confused and didn't bother to answer Susie's question. She looked around, and seeing that the servants were at their stations and not paying particular attention to her, she raised her head slightly and calmly turned to enter Count Hall's study. At the desk, Audrey looked down at the report and saw that the title was exactly as Susie had described it. It's document typed by a typewriter. The investigator is a reporter named Mike Joseph. There's the goddess's sacred emblem at the bottom. Was this commissioned by the Church of the Goddess? But why is Father given a copy? Oh, Father is a believer of the goddess, and the church wants him to provide some support on this matter? That's a good thing. Audrey made a preliminary judgment. She had originally thought of hiring others to do a similar investigation, but she felt that this was not in accordance with her intention of guiding others behind the scenes. It was very easy to be noticed and no longer be ignored by the other nobles, therefore, she had been hesitant. Audrey reached for the file and flipped through it. She found that Mike Joseph wasn't the only one reporting on East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district. There were also quite a few people who had made their own field investigations from different angles. Some of them even mentioned the proliferation of cults, and how some Beyonders were colluding with the gangs. Phew. Audrey looked at the clock in the study and saw that it was almost 3. She quickly gave up on reading the report carefully and returned the document to its original state. Before she left, she picked up a book and used it as a disguise for her purpose of entry. At 3 o'clock sharp. While the chiming of the hanging clock was still reverberating through the air, Audrey had already appeared inside the majestic palace via the dark red, illusory light and found herself beside the ancient long table. She smiled, stood up, and bowed in the direction of the seat of honor. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Having received a light nod in response, she then respectively greeted the hanged man, the world, and company. She keenly noticed that the sun seemed to be a little uneasy. "What are you worried about?" Audrey asked. This spared Klein's need to speak, having also noticed that little sun didn't seem right. Entering this mysterious space ahead of time, he tidied the items on the table, tossing them into a corner along with Azek's copper whistle, the biological poison bottle, Numinous Episcopat's copper whistle, and other things. He had then covered them with a thick fog. Presently, there was only the Dark Emperor card on the table before him. This was an item that matched the identity of the fool. Derek didn't hide anything and immediately recounted his successful malingering, and how he was sent to the bottom of the spire to be isolated for treatment. Finally, he asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, will that mystical item detect my participation in the Tarot Club?" "How would I know? I don't even know what it is. However, there are currently no strange or powerful forces attempting to invade." Even the eternal blazing sun and the true creator couldn't find this place. Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the long bronze table and replied in a relaxed manner, "Generally speaking, it wouldn't make any discoveries. But some mystical items possess special effects." Seeing that Mr. Fool had given an affirmative answer, Derek was immediately relieved. He tersely gave acknowledgement and said, "I'm not sure of its special effects either. It's one of the City of Silver's top secrets." At this point, he suddenly thought of what the former captain of the exploration team had told him. He blurted out a question, "Have any of you heard of a person named Amon?" Amon? After a moment's thought, Klein remembered the source of the familiarity. But he didn't answer in a hurry. Instead, he looked at the hanged man, knowing full well that this middle-ranking member of the Church of the Lord of Storms also knew Amon, and perhaps he knew even more than he did. Similarly, Audrey also looked at the hanged man. She had also heard the name from him the last time. Furs listened with a blank face, feeling that the things discussed here were always outside the scope of her knowledge. Alger frowned and asked in confusion, "You ran into a man who called himself Amon while you were exploring the surrounding areas of the City of Silver? Or perhaps, you discovered related records?" Derek nodded seriously and said, "Yes, 42 years ago. An exploratory team encountered a man claiming to be Amon in the depths of the darkness. After they returned to the City of Silver, they lost control one after another. Only one of them was left, and he was imprisoned at the bottom of the spire, in the cell next to me. Maybe he went mad too, and that was just a figment of his imagination." Furs, with a wealth of novel creation experience, postulated a guess. Alger glanced at Mr. Fool, who sat at the end of the table. Seeing him appear staid and without expressing anything, he boldly said, "Imagination is a possibility, but one shouldn't imagine the name Amon for no reason." He turned his head to the sun and said, "In the fourth epoch, about 1,500 years ago in the kingdom we live in, there was a family with strange powers. They belonged to the Tudor dynasty, and their surname was Amon. Even in an era with numerous high-sequence Beyonders, the surname of the clan was taboo." Chapter 359, The Blasphemer. Justice. Audrey asked instead of the sun, "Why?" The hanged man, Alger, didn't answer her directly as he continued on, "Abraham, Antigonus, Amon, Jacob, and Tamara are the 5 great families that supported the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, and they were second only to the Blood Emperor. Among them, the Amon family is the most mysterious one. They have the least history left behind, and they seemed to have been distorted and covered up by some kind of power. There was a piece of information that came from the King of the Five Seas, Nast. The Amans are a family of blasphemers, and they wield the secrets to usurp the powers of deities. Also, the Aman family call themselves the descendants of the ancient sun god. Derek Berg was left confused. In his knowledge of myths, there was no such thing as an ancient sun god. Among the 8 ancient deities, Giant King, Ormer, Dragon of Imagination, Enkwelt, Mutated King, Kvaster, Elf King, Saniathrim, King of Demonic Wolves, Phlegria, Vampire Ancestor, Lilith, Phoenix Ancestor, Greggrace, and Devil Monarch, Farbody, none of them wielded the power of the sun. Derek seriously considered this problem. If I really need to make a connection, the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God had shown powers in the sun domain. Could the Aman family be his descendant? Noticing that Sun wasn't saying anything, Alger stroked the stubble on his chin and said, "The Aman family is an ancient family clan from 1 to 2,000 years ago. It is almost history itself. I'm very curious, why did the gentleman that you met appear around the City of Silver? What is his goal?" "That's right, how could the Aman family, which exists in the world of Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and company, appear around our City of Silver? Why did he fail to fulfill his promise after accepting the request of being a guest? He mysteriously left and caused the entire team to lose control." "Yes, other than the captain. What did he want to do? What was he looking for? If he is a descendant of the Lord, perhaps his purpose is the same as mine, to find out the cause of the cataclysm from ancient times and to find out the truth of the curse." Derek let his imagination run wild for a moment. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Mr. Hanged Man, I'm unable to answer your question. I'm also trying to figure out this matter." Alger replied, looking somewhat disappointed, "Try to communicate with the former captain in your neighboring cell more. See if you can dig up more information from him." Upon saying this, he thought for a moment and warned, "However, you must be careful and prudent. I think that person is very dangerous." "Very dangerous? You think so too?" Derek asked, feeling somewhat surprised. The elders of the 6-member council also thought the same. The Hanged Man looked up at the lofty dome and took a deep breath. "Those who don't think so are the ones without sound minds." Seeing that the sun was still confused, he shook his head and said, "He's the only surviving member of the exploration team. Just this matter alone is enough to prove that there's something tremendously wrong with him. He's been in the dungeon facing rampagers for 42 years, yet, he remains very lucid and rational. This shows how weird he is. Compounded with the matter regarding the mysterious Aman, the danger is obvious." These were the little bits and pieces that Derek had thought about in the past, but he hadn't yet connected together. When he heard that, he suddenly became enlightened and immediately said sincerely, "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man." Audrey, who was listening attentively and observing, resisted the urge to cover her face with her hand. She felt that the sun was even more naive than she was. Seeing that everyone's curiosity had been satisfied, that even the gloomy Mr. World had slightly adjusted his posture, and that the sun didn't seem to have any other requests, she turned her head to the end of the long bronze table and said with a smile, "Mr. Fool, I request a private exchange." Again. Klein was amused as he nodded and said, "Sure." He immediately shielded the senses of the Hanged Man and company, rather than isolating himself and Miss Justice. It was mainly because he was afraid that the others might end up communicating out of boredom, thereby exposing the fact that the world was only a repeater. After receiving the signal, Audrey smiled and said, "Mr. Fool, I have another 3 new pages of Roselle's diary." After the card of blasphemy was stolen by the Fool's adorer, she didn't avoid visiting the Royal Museum out of guilt. Instead, she acted as if nothing had happened. She openly requested this to her father, and in the week after the exhibition ended, she got another chance to flip through the notebook. Audrey thought that appearing unfazed was the best way to avoid suspicion. If she maintained the constant act of feeling guilty and did not do what was logical, even if the Church of the God of Steam didn't suspect her previously, they would subsequently feel that there was a problem. According to her own experience, she believed that the very first few pages of a diary would reveal a lot of information, so she mainly memorized the first 3 pages. Without waiting for the fool to speak, she quickly added, "I understand that this isn't a matter that requires a private exchange, but I wish to keep this from Miss Magician for a week or 2. That way, even if she knows that you need Roselle's diary in the future, she wouldn't suspect that I'm Justice." She had seen Furs and Zio once midweek, and by leading the conversation, she had naturally mentioned how her beloved dog, Susie, had chewed the Roselle notebook, causing it to be irrecoverable. Typically speaking, she no longer needed to hide the fact that Mr. Fool needed Roselle's diary, but using her telepathist abilities, she simulated what Furs would think, believing that she would have such a thought. "What? That's a diary? That's a diary Roselle recorded his secrets in? Even Mr. Fool places so much importance on it. I recall that Miss Audrey has some." Wait a moment. She happened to have those diary pages chewed up by her dog a few days ago. Isn't this too much of a coincidence? To prevent Furs from having such thoughts, Audrey hoped to keep it a secret for at least another week. After becoming a telepathist, not only was she able to see the aura and the emotional color of the target, but she was also able to read the superficial thoughts of others and could also simulate their thoughts. Thus, she understood one thing, that in the process of guiding others, she had to try her best not to be abrupt or act against logic and reason. Only when all the details were subtle enough and reasonable enough to make the target not realize that she was being guided, would she be considered a qualified telepathist. Subtle and reasonable are the 2 most important keywords. Audrey concluded in her mind. The reason why she went to read Roselle's notebook again was precisely to avoid being unreasonable. She truly is worthy of being a telepathist. She's recognized long ago that Miss Magician is one of the 2 people that she had recommended. Klein smiled in a noncommittal manner. "What do you want to exchange those 3 pages for?" This question was asked with confidence because, after obtaining the Book of Secrets, his greatest weakness in the field of mysticism had already been bridged. As for the secrets of the other deities, as well as his knowledge of sequences, he knew a lot about them. Just any one of them was enough to deal with Miss Justice. "We will still be friends if you don't talk about the psychiatrist formula," Klein lampooned in his heart. Audrey had already long thought of her question. She remained reserved for a second before saying, "Mr. Fool, I wish to ask one question. Why is it said that the cards of blasphemy hide the profound secrets of the deities?" "Great question." Klein smiled secretly. Giving her a look for her to figure it out herself, he said deeply and calmly, "Sequence 0, Dark Emperor." "Sequence 0? There's still a Sequence 0? There's a Sequence 0 above Sequence 1? Is that a sequence representing a god? The Dark Emperor is a god?" A series of questions suddenly surfaced in Audrey's mind. This caused her to be pleasantly surprised, satisfied, and shocked. Restraining her agitation and unconcealable excitement, she took a deep breath and conjured the 3 pages of Roselle's diary. Klein took a quick glance, and confirmed that this was not one of the ones he had seen before. February 23, 1143. I've transmigrated to this world for more than a week. I have to write something down and describe the things I have encountered, or I feel like I'll go crazy. If I write it in simplified Chinese, I'm sure that no one will be able to decipher it. This world uses alphabetical words. I am now Roselle Gustave, but I'll never forget my real name. Huang Tao. I don't know how I transmigrated either. I carefully recalled and thought about it for a long time, and then I remembered that a few days before my transmigration, I bought a very mysterious silver plate with some strange symbols and patterns engraved on it. It was extremely interesting. However, it did not reappear after my transmigration here. It's not my cheat item. This is a world similar to ancient Europe. It's after the Renaissance, and cannons and guns have appeared, but they're rather crude and primitive. As for me, Huang Tao Roselle Gustave, as a fan of online literature, I loved reading transmigration with technology genre novels. I know quite a lot of useful things and specifically read up on the corresponding knowledge. This is the stage where I can display my abilities. But I realize that my fucking memory isn't good. I've almost forgotten everything. The heavens allowed me to transmigrate to another world, but I wasn't given an outstanding memory or a system. Nor was I given a two-way door. How can I survive like this? Alright, I'll start with some details. When I have the money, I'll hire a bunch of craftsmen, inventors, and scientists. I'm only responsible for giving them ideas. It's been a long time since I've felt so full of anticipation for the future. But I still miss Mom and Dad a little. Besides, the entertainment in this world is too monotonous. The one or two maids don't look that good, and their entire bodies exude rustic vibes. It makes me wish that Hongxiu Com goes completely bankrupt. I haven't finished reading Lin Gao's 500 good-for-nothings sup a 2e/sup, and there are so many beauties that are awaiting me on TikTok. The games, Kings of Glory and PUBG, are still waiting for me. Thinking about them makes me feel a little depressed. As Klein read, he nearly frowned. Initially, he had determined, from the appearance of Pirate King and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, that Roselle had crossed over 3 to 5 years earlier than him. But now, he realized that the gap between their transmigrations couldn't be more than a year. But why was there a difference of nearly 200 years on this side? Chapter 360, a difficult conundrum. Klein thought seriously for a while and came up with all sorts of theories, but because he lacked the necessary information, he could only temporarily ascribe the cause of the matter to the difference in the flow of time between the Earth and this world. Roselle and I have transmigrated less than a year apart, but in this world, we are separated by nearly 200 years. That is to say, even if I were to spend 200 years to find a way to return, it's likely that I won't lose the opportunity to meet my parents. At most, I'd have been missing for a year. Klein made a contrasting inference, improving his mood significantly. He instantly felt filled with motivation. Of course, he himself knew very well that this reasoning was not rigorous, because this was determined by one precondition, and it was currently impossible to confirm it. What if Roselle transmigrated after me? That might involve so-called spatial-temporal turbulence. When the time comes, there is no guarantee that I'll return to the proper time node. Klein poured cold water on his burgeoning mood. Roselle's first diary entry was the product of having held back for a long time, therefore, it took up more than 2 pages. Klein flipped to the end and read the remaining 2 lines. February 25th. What a boring world. There are no newspapers and so few novels. I think I need to help this culturally impoverished society, but the premise of this is that I have to get some money and recall how paper is made and how the print press is done. As a transmigrator, I can only live on the pocket money that my new dad and mom gave me. I can only occasionally see 1 or 2 shiny Fermo gold. What a tragic story. However, hunting is quite interesting. February 28th. This world might be a little different from what I know it to be. I got lost while hunting in the woods today. As a result, I saw an unimaginably intense battle. In the battle, the man who was surrounded had additional eyes growing on his face, a total of 4 eyes. They even shot dark green light. This is fucking illogical. Is this a humanoid monster? This is actually a fantasy world, right? That monster's opponent was even more powerful. He summoned a pillar of light that burned with golden flames. Yes, I think it was summoned. Fortunately, they didn't discover me. After getting rid of that monster, that person left with the corpse. I, Huang Tao, am indeed the protagonist. I discovered the truth of this world a few days after I transmigrated. Perhaps they can recognize the mysterious symbols and patterns on the silver token. Of course, I won't ask. I want to become like them and crack it myself. There's another key reason as to why I said this. I can't even fucking remember what the pattern looks like. I can only vaguely remember it. Indeed the protagonist? Emperor, did you pour all of your 8th grader syndrome soul into your diary? Klein couldn't help but lampoon. He was very interested in the silver plate, which might have been the cause for Roselle's transmigration, and he was eager to find out what the symbols and patterns on it looked like. If he could really decipher it by relying on the mysticism knowledge of this world, then transmigration might not have just been a coincidence. Klein put down the diary pages, wrapped his fingers on the table, and lifted the screen that isolated the hanged man and the magician. Go ahead and trade freely. Klein leaned back in his chair and smiled. Furs took a deep breath and said, I would like to purchase the stomach pouch of a spirit eater and 20 milliliters of blood from a deep-sea marlin. It will be paid for in gold pounds. I still have 430 pounds, I can afford one, she silently encouraged herself. As for where the rest of the money would come from, she had no idea. This is one of the main reasons that prevent many Beyonders from advancing. People cannot really attempt to spend beyond their means. If it wasn't for me having to become a trick master to completely be rid of the influence of the full moon's ravings, I wouldn't even consider advancement once I gained rich Beyonder means. I wouldn't even make contact with this circle. I'll write books, save up money, drink tea, and stroll the streets with Zio. Once she's finished with that task, we can travel to different parts of the northern and southern continent. We don't have to be afraid of danger or accidents, and we can enjoy life. Furza's thoughts suddenly began to wander. Just when she thought that no one would respond, Alger said in a low voice, I saw the deep-sea marlin's blood at the recent gathering of the great pirates, but unfortunately, you've already missed it. You should have said so earlier. No, I'm mistaken. You hadn't joined the tarot club back then. Then what's the point of saying this? Showing off your experience? Furs curled her lips secretly but said in all seriousness, Mr. Hanged Man, please keep an eye out for me. I can accept a price between 300 and 400 pounds. Alger sneered. The sea is even vaster than the land. Pirates might not even meet each other in half a year. Even on the islands that they dispose of their loot, Beyonder ingredients are seldom gathered. Only big cities like Backlund, Trier, St. Millum, and Fainapotter can have many ingredients gathered together. From your accent, you should be a Backlund citizen, or someone who has been living in Backlund for many years. You mean that I still need to rely on myself? Furs almost looked up at the high dome. At this point, Derek said, I know roughly where a few spirit eaters are active. But I don't need the gold pounds you people talk about. Furs said with a fake smile, what do you want? The formula for the Solar High Priest potion. Audrey quickly answered inwardly. Derek thought seriously and said, the Solar High Priest potion formula. That's a sequence 7 formula, right? I've heard of it, but the formula for this sequence is at least 750 pounds, and if you're in a hurry to get it, it can be sold for more than 1,000 pounds. Furthermore, the stomach bag of a spirit eater and blood of a deep-sea marlin do not exceed 400 pounds each. They're only worth 300 pounds most of the time. Do you understand me? Furs tried to make it clear to the son that this was not an equivalent transaction. Without hesitation, Derek replied, I can give you 2 or 3 of the spirit eater's stomach bags. As for the additional need for a deep-sea marlin, he didn't even consider it. He had never even seen the sea before. What can I do with the additional spirit eater's stomach bags? Roast them or fry them? To be honest, I have no idea when I'll be able to sell it. Most importantly, I'm unable to afford the formula for Solar High Priest. Furs forced a smile and said, I'll try searching. She thought of the masked eternal blazing sun believer at Mr. A's gathering who was good at purification. She thought of the band of light ring, and she believed that she could get a clue to the potion formula of Solar High Priest. But I don't have enough money. Furs thought for a moment, touched her face, looked around, and then asked with great sincerity, everyone, do you have any good ways of earning money? As soon as she finished her sentence, she realized that everyone had fallen into silence. Silence could be described by the soundless palace and the quiet gray fog. From the looks of it, everyone faces this conundrum. As for Mr. Fool, he doesn't need money. Furs wisely shut her mouth. Isn't the best way to make money be from owning farms, mines, plantations, factories, stocks, etc.? Oh, you can also go through the kingdom's bounty notices and complete them in accordance with the price and the period of time at a bearable level. Audrey knew that she didn't have any real experience in making money, so she could only respond with a few words in her heart as if she was joking. Might I interest you in bicycle projects? Klein resisted the urge to manipulate the words of the world, which would expose his true identity. After waiting for a few seconds, he maintained an unfathomable posture, making the world gloomily and hoarsely say, "Help me keep a lookout for the thousand-faced hunter's mutated pituitary gland and blood, as well as a human-skinned shadow's characteristic and a deep-sea Naga's hair." Although Klein only had 589 gold pounds left, he now had the Beyonder characteristic of a werewolf and the biological poison bottle. Furthermore, he was considering to find an opportunity to turn the former into a mystical item and then sell one of them. In that case, that's more than enough to match the cost of Sequence 6 Beyonder ingredient. Therefore, he planned to have the members of the Tarot Club help him pay attention in advance so that he wouldn't miss them. All right. The son, Derek, answered first, but he made no promises. Compared to a spirit eater, human-skinned shadows and thousand-faced hunters aren't monsters that are easy to encounter. Thousand-faced hunter? I think I've seen a fossil of it, Justice thought as she replied, yes, I'll confirm that after I return. That fossil was in Duke Negan's treasury. If it's already a fossil, its Beyonder characteristic has probably long been taken away. Klein manipulated the world and nodded noncommittally. After a moment of silence, Alger said, "Help me keep an eye out on a person who was involved in the disappearance of the colonial slaves that was mentioned before. He calls himself Balin, a man with reddish-brown skin and has the clear characteristics of a southerner, but someone has overheard him speak in a Backland accent. The third tooth on his left is missing, but it could very well have been replaced. In addition, there's nothing special about him, and his height is also quite average. If you can find traces of him, there will be no problem with the reward at all, with it being at least 100 pounds or something of equal value. Even divination can't be completed with such a description, let alone carrying out a search for the person in the real world." Klein looked around and said, "Continue with your free exchange." At the end of the tarot gathering, Derek returned to the real world and found himself in the dark, cramped room. He sat on the ground cautiously for a few seconds, but he didn't discover any unusual changes. He was finally able to let out a sigh of relief. Remembering that Mr. Hanged Man had advised him to talk more with the former exploratory team's captain, Derek walked over to the corresponding metal wall, bent his fingers, and tapped on it. Tack. Tack. He completed his signal, but there was no response even after a long time. Did he fall asleep? Or was he taken to the 6-member council? Derek wondered while looking at the dull metal wall. At this moment, an elderly and fleeting voice came from the bed behind him. "Are you looking for me?" Chapter 361, Translucent Worm, "Are you looking for me?" The moment the voice entered his ears, Derek froze. His skin tensed up, and his hair stood on end. Why is he behind me? Why is he in my room? What happened to the seal? What about the effects of the mystical items? His forehead dripped with cold sweat, and he subconsciously wanted to turn around to take a look. But his instincts stopped him from doing so. This instinct originated from the teachings of the City of Silver's general knowledge of monsters lessons and the strange scene he had experienced after joining the patrolling teams. When someone is speaking behind you, don't turn around in a hurry. Derek raised his hands and clenched them into fists in front of his chest, then slowly, he turned around, bit by bit. The room was shrouded in darkness, making it impossible to see anything. However, there was a tint of golden light that was expanding in his two eyes, transforming into what seemed like two miniature suns. With his light's suppliant powers, he saw a dark figure sitting quietly on the edge of his bed. The dark figure rapidly turned clear, revealing a head that had been split in half. In the middle of his head, two gray brains wriggled like they were alive, trying to get close to each other but being unable to do so. The thick, viscous liquid on the severed surface of his brain had turned into thin threads, but they were shrinking like maggots. Each eye that was on the two separate sides were distanced apart, and the nose bridge was separated from the middle. The color of the blood was bright and evident. The left side of his mouth was open, but the right side of his mouth was tightly shut. This terrifying monster was naked, and there were numerous dark red wounds on its body. The countless wounds had torn open savagely, revealing rows and rows of white teeth. They said the same sentence in quick succession. "Are you looking for me?" It paused for a moment. The corners of its mouth and the edges of its wounds were curling up. "Look, am I not normal?" Derek's pupils contracted, and without thinking, he placed his folded hands on his chest and raised them to his chin, as if in prayer. The small room suddenly became bright, and a pure beam of light, swirling with fire, fell from the roof and onto the monster's body. The beam was not as grand as the one used by Derek outside the spire. This was because of the seal here and the mystical item which left him isolated from the spire's exterior. But at that moment, Derek was stunned to see the holy light beam that he had prayed for was suddenly thickening. It was so bright that he couldn't help but close his eyes. A few moments later, something purer and thicker separated from the magnificent pillar of light. It was like a man made of light with no facial features and no clothes. The man of light suddenly coruscated and pounced on the monster. All the mouths on the monster suddenly opened, as if it was letting out a blood-curdling screech. Yet, Derek heard nothing. The monster began to tremble violently and quickly disintegrated under the burning and illumination of the man of light, disappearing as if it were melting. Just as it was about to become transparent, a phantom wearing a black classical long robe and a pointed hat suddenly appeared. The shadow had black hair, black eyes, a wide forehead, and a thin face. It wore a monocle carved from crystal. As soon as he appeared, the man of light exploded, and Derek's vision was filled with whiteness. When his eyesight was restored, he found himself outside the room, in the corridor with the metal lamps set in it, in the dim light of the setting sun. He tilted his head blankly and looked into the room. He saw a tall, muscular figure in dark trousers and a brown coat. In front of this figure was the bed which Derek had been sleeping in. Dawn-like rays of light condensed onto a white leg bone, turning it into a pure white, sharp sword. Next to the straight sword lay a translucent worm. It was only the length of a thumb, and its slimness was almost that of a child's finger. One ring after another, of completely transparent colors, divided it into many sections. It was a fleeting scene, and without specially counting the number of rings, he had a vague feeling that there were about 10 of them. The tall figure which had its back facing him reached out his hand to pick up the strange translucent worm. As he turned around, he sighed. It was close. At that moment, Derek finally saw the face of the tall figure. His hair was grizzled, unkempt, and rather disheveled. He had deep wrinkles around his cheeks, but there were no wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Some old scars, that were either deep or twisted, remained on his cheeks. He was dressed in a flaxen-colored shirt with a checkered leather belt around his waist, and his pale blue eyes were deep and weathered, like a book full of stories. For a moment, Derek was stunned, and then, as though he had been in danger all his life, he opened his mouth in pleasant surprise. "Your Excellency." In front of him was Chief of the City of Silver's 6-member council, a powerful demon hunter who was over 100 years old, Colin Iliad. Colin nodded slightly and said, "We always knew that he had a problem, but in order to find out what kind of ulterior motives the man named Amon had, we intentionally didn't eliminate him directly, and we instead locked him at the bottom of the spire, sealed under the influence of mystical items, and we often let Beyonders, who only have symptoms of losing control, live next to him and talk to him. We wanted to see if we could induce some abnormal changes in him in order to learn the information we wanted to know. Unfortunately, he had been very normal until today, way too normal. Why do you think he suddenly mutated and attempted to break through the seal? Do you have any idea what makes you different from the others? So it was purposely arranged for me to live next to the former exploration team captain." After a few seconds of silence, Derek said, "Maybe it's because my Beyonder pathway is different from the others." Sequence 9 Bard, Sequence 8 Light Suppliant. In other words, the Sun pathway. If Mr. Hanged Man is right, that the Amon family is the descendant of an ancient sun god, then it's normal for me to cause a mutation to happen to him. Derek felt he knew the truth to a certain extent. Colin listened without a change in expression. He sized up Derek for a few seconds before saying, "We were monitoring him. The members of the 6-member council took turns, but we didn't expect him to suddenly mutate. There were 0 warning signs, and his actions were very decisive and determined." "What were you doing in the room just now?" Derek, who was considering the relationship between the sun pathway and the ancient sun god, didn't instantly realize what the chief was asking about. When he realized it, his mind was still blank as he seriously recalled what he had done. "I didn't do anything. I just knocked on the wall and tried to talk to him. Before this, I was participating in the tarot gathering." The tarot gathering. Derek was suddenly stunned. He felt that things might not be as simple as he had imagined. He knew that he couldn't inform the chief of his thoughts, but he didn't know what kind of expression to make, so he could only maintain his lonely, reserved silence. He said thoughtfully, "I knocked on that wall 3 times. Before that, the candle in my room had extinguished, and there was complete darkness. I had tried to practice some of my Beyonder powers." Colin looked into Derek's eyes quietly and said after nearly 20 seconds, "Unfortunately, what Amon left in his soul was not his original body. Moreover, this matter happened too suddenly, so we were unable to obtain the desired result. Before his mutation, did you sense anything amiss?" "No." Derek shook his head with conviction. Colin's eyes suddenly flashed with 2 complex, dark green symbols, and he reflected Derek's body in them. After nearly 10 seconds of silence, the City of Silver's chief closed his eyes and said, "Your condition has stabilized. You don't need any more treatment, so you can go back now." Derek was startled. "All right." He watched demon hunter Colin Iliad turn back into the room, pick up the sharp white sword, and turn it over and over in his hands. He quietly took a deep breath and walked along the corridor towards the exit. On the way, he met the keepers who had rushed over one after the other. He slowly walked back home and closed the door. He carefully observed his surroundings for a while, then he sat down on the edge of the bed and recited in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, you are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." "I've just experienced something terrifying." Derek recounted what had happened and mentioned his 2 guesses. After doing all of that, he felt much more at ease. And with his tense state of mind relaxing, he felt immense exhaustion wash through him. He lied down and quickly fell asleep. In the silent and dark room, flashes of lightning would occasionally illuminate everything. Otherwise, it would seem like the dark night. The sleeping Derek suddenly flicked his right index finger and leisurely tapped it on the bed. Once, twice, thrice. After the tarot gathering, Klein didn't divine the werewolf's Beyonder characteristic or the biological poison bottle due to his spirituality expenditure. Instead, he went straight back to the real world for a nap. After 20 minutes, he woke up and drew the curtain, allowing the light that penetrated through the mist to bring a certain degree of light into the room. Sitting on the chair in front of the desk, Klein calmed down and began considering what he needed to do in the short term. The main goal is to continue concluding the rules of a magician and make adjustments according to the subtle feedback from my spirituality. Although rules like never performing unprepared, the need to have a stage and a performance, and completing a performance using means of diversion, do not seem problematic at the moment, if I were to continue acting this way and performing slight adjustments, I'll eventually digest the potion and reach the advancement state. But this sort of acting isn't sufficient. I'm still lacking some of the important rules. Currently, what I'm doing will make the digestion slow and not thorough. Perhaps it will take a year, or perhaps even 2 or 3 years before my sequence advancement is possible. And Ince Zangwil won't remain there waiting for me. Only through becoming a high-sequence Beyonder as soon as possible will I be qualified to take revenge. Therefore, figuring out the other magician rules is of utmost importance. I'll first determine them through experimentation whether the applause from an audience will stir my spirituality and result in better digestion of the potion. Just as Klein was deep in thought, he heard a series of illusory, stacked pleas. Chapter 362, the secret deed ritual a male voice? Is it Mr. Hanged Man or Little Sun? Klein looked out the window at the gloomy sky, got up, went into the bathroom next door. He locked the door, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and arrived above the gray fog. Within that mysterious space, a towering, ancient palace quietly stood. The illusory male voice echoed in a stacked, continuous manner. Klein glanced at it and confirmed that the prayer was from Little Sunday. He sat in the fool's seat and stretched out his right hand, emanating his spirituality to touch the corresponding crimson star. Suddenly, the voice became clear and layered, and Klein quickly figured out what the sun was talking about. The former captain of the exploration team, who had seen Amon, suddenly lost control and strangely penetrated through the seal, arriving at his room. Fortunately, the City of Silver took this matter seriously and had been constantly prepared for it, otherwise, it would have led to a tragedy. The Sun believes that it's impossible that there was no reason for the man's loss of control. He came up with 2 possibilities. One was that his own Beyonder pathway met the requirements of being the ancient sun god's descendant, and the other possibility was that the man might have sensed the tarot gathering and Mr. Fool's secret pull. If it were the former, he wouldn't have waited until today and waited until the end of the tarot gathering before losing control. The latter reason has a greater probability. This is the first time I've encountered someone who can sense the matters regarding the gray fog. That Amon is very scary. It's no wonder their family was known as the Blasphemers during the 4th epoch. Even their last names are taboo. Klein subconsciously looked at the crimson star and the corresponding supplicant. He carefully observed the blurry image of Little Sun to see if there was anything abnormal with him. Klein believed that Amon wouldn't be so easily eliminated. Even if it was as the chief of the City of Silver had said, that his body wasn't his main body, it didn't make it any easier to eliminate him. The only possibility is that the powerhouses in the City of Silver have been using mystical items to monitor him, but is that even possible? When he decided to let the former leader of the exploration team lose control and silently penetrate through the seal, he definitely had a plan in place. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein's eyes suddenly froze as he looked at the prayer scene. Entwined on the indistinct body of the sun was a translucent and illusory figure. He had hands and feet, but he was like a python, twisting around the sun while his head rested behind the sun's head. In the blurred image, he was wearing a black classical robe, a pointed hat, and a crystal monocle. The sun didn't notice any of this. Klein almost drew a cold gasp, shocked at the strange means that were available to that entity. He vaguely understood the other party's intention. By residing in the spirit body of the sun, he is waiting for the next tarot gathering, allowing him to sneak above the gray fog, like a virus or a Trojan horse. When that happens, my control over this mysterious space might be snatched away. He's truly a blasphemer. Fortunately, Little Sun is rather naive and straightforward, so he immediately reported this to me. Through the corresponding crimson stars and the power of the gray fog, I was able to discover his peculiar state. Klein drew a breath and tried to calm himself. At that moment, he had to respond. He had to quickly think of a way to get Amon out of the sun, or temporarily expel the sun out of the tarot gathering. Looking at himself, from his beyonder powers of magician, clown, and seer, to Azek's copper whistle, the Dark Emperor card, the all-black eye, the sun brooch, the biological poison bottle, and so on, Klein couldn't find a way to deal with Amon. Amon's sequence is definitely above sequence 4, and the means available to him must be sufficiently strange. To be able to escape from the City of Silver's mystical artifacts and powerful demon hunters, it means that he isn't something which can be easily eliminated with ordinary objects or powers. After thinking for a moment and looking around, Klein discovered there was only one possibility of eliminating Amon, the gray fog, this mysterious space. I have to think of a way to pry its power away. The sacrifice and bestowment ritual from before are examples. With this train of thought, Klein turned his gaze to the Book of Secrets. This mysticism book, which originated from the ancient shaman King Klarman, recorded many mysterious rituals that required help from the primitive moon. Klein, who had been reading it before, vaguely remembered that a few of them were suitable for such a scenario. Of course, it was unknown what changes he would have to make after directing it towards the Fool. He could only keep his hopes up and try his best. As Klein flipped through the book, his eyes stopped at a ritual. Blood Moon Sacrifice. This ritualistic magic was clearly different from the simple ones that Klein had learned before, and it used the element of a secret deed. The process was to use a material rich in spirituality, preferably the blood of a beyonder, to write the honorable name of the target of the secret deed on an animal hide, and to draw the corresponding symbols and magic labels. If necessary, the specific circumstances of a given time and place also had to be taken into account. When this was done, the ritual host would set up the altar, pick up the piece of hide, and repeat the honorable name, letting their spirituality to seep into the hide, gradually spreading it out, little by little to form a hidden bond with the corresponding great being, and obtaining the corresponding spiritual experience or help. The final outcome of this ritual was unknown. It all depended on what the hidden or great being bestowed. Or rather, according to one's characteristics, the knowledge and power one could gain through that secret bond were also different. This kind of rather vague and subjective ritual gave Klein enough freedom to modify and manipulate it. If he had assumed the stance of forcefully eliminating Amon from the beginning, then Amon would have certainly resisted and created a dangerous accident. If the target of the secret deed were the true creator or the hidden sage, it's normal for the ritual to end in madness. Klein mumbled as he conjured a pen and paper and began to modify the Blood Moon Sacrifice to turn it into a secret deed ritual that belonged to the Fool. First, he replaced the honorable name with the 3 sentences of King of Yellow and Black. Then, he replaced the symbolic symbol with the one behind the seat of the Fool. It was a unique symbol made up of a part of the hidden pupilless eye and the contorted lines. The third was to design the corresponding magic label according to the symbols and his mysticism knowledge. This was the most difficult step. Any mistakes would cause the entire ritual to produce unpredictable developments. Lastly, he had to modify the layout of the altar to make it closer to the Fool and to the King of Yellow and Black. After busying himself for quite a while, Klein had a new secret deed ritual, but he was unsure if it would work. He examined it over and over again, and after confirming that there were no mistakes, he emanated his spirituality and heavily replied to Little Sun, "I'm aware. I have something to task you with. Let's see if this ritual works." The son Derek suddenly woke up from his dreamless slumber. Before his eyes were the boundless gray fog and the lofty Fool. His ears echoed with bits of illusory and distant words. He knew that Mr. Fool would occasionally ask the members of the Tarot Club to make small attempts as if to verify something. He wasn't surprised by this, and he immediately sat up and began to search for a monster hide, exotic herbs, and other objects. As for the spiritual materials described in the ceremony, Derek didn't waste time heading to the spire or the underground market to buy them. He picked up the axe of Hurricane and sliced a tiny wound in his arm. Silently, he used his own blood as ink, and he wrote the name of the Fool and its corresponding symbols and magic labels on the pitted monster hide. After a while, he put down the quill that was stained with blood. He saw many mysterious symbols on the hide, and the colors were bright red and had an indescribable hint of demonic dealings. After dealing with the wound on his arm, the pale-faced Derek quickly finished setting up the altar. He picked up the blood-red word and all kinds of terrifying symbols from the hide and held it tightly in his hand. He looked at the flickering candle flame in front of him, closed his eyes, lowered his head, and repeatedly recited the honorable names of the Fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck. Derek's spirituality slowly flowed out and infused the hide, and the words in Jotun and the magic symbols on it quickly brightened. It was a startling crimson color. At that moment, he, who had already entered into a cogitation state, was only feeling his psyche gradually dissipate as it floated to an immeasurable height, coming into contact with the grayish-white fog, and the hidden great being. Above the gray fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Noticing that the sun had not shown any signs of delay in preparing the ritual, Klein chose to wait there above the gray fog. Suddenly, he felt the entire mysterious space start to tremble. That motionless grayish-white fog started to flow. The crimson star corresponding to the sun shined brightly and emitted illusory rays of light like the tide. These countless rays of light condensed into a blurry figure of the sun. He was in a supplicating position with his eyes closed and his head lowered, waiting for the moment when he could bond with the great being and gain a miraculous spiritual experience. The translucent figure on his body was still tightly coiled like a python, but its head was already tilted back as it looked up. The crystal monocle it wore flashed dimly. He's searching for the subtle, hidden connection. He should have recognized that this is just a secret deed ritual, but he didn't do anything to stop it. Is he trying to find the connection through it? Klein suddenly came to this realization, and felt the gray fog in the mysterious space above it simultaneously rippling with power. However, for the time being, Klein couldn't combine these forces with his own spirituality to create a beyonder effect that could exorcise the evil spirit, unless there was another corresponding ritual. Clearly, this was impossible. He couldn't maintain two rituals simultaneously. Klein's eyes quickly swept the area in front of him, and his gaze stopped at the sun brooch. Chapter 363, High-Level Authority. Perhaps I can use it as a bridge. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, his right hand grabbed the sunbird-shaped dark golden brooch. At the same time, he used his spirituality as a whirlpool to attract the pride power from the mysterious space towards him, making it surge towards the sun brooch like a tidal wave. The quivering above the gray fog became obvious. Little dots of pure light intertwined and swept toward Klein, blending with his spirituality. The sunbird-shaped dark golden brooch began to glow with a dazzling brilliance. It grew brighter and denser, and in an instant, drop after drop of a translucent golden liquid began to condense. The liquid quickly merged together and formed a human figure that was as tall as Klein. It was a golden figure, a sacred figure. It does work. Sun holy water that's created from a higher level of power is closer to a god's bestowment. Klein's heart was filled with joy. He turned his gaze back to the crimson star which symbolized the sun. He then looked at the figure that was waiting to bond with the great being. As for the divine figure condensed by the golden sun holy water, it wasn't a result of the sun brooch, but simply a manifestation of Klein's subconscious thoughts. Reaching this step, he had already allowed the golden figure to move forward. Through the illusory crimson star, it merged with little sun through the secret deed ritual as it dispelled the evil spirit hidden inside his body, as well as giving him a certain amount of knowledge and a miraculous spiritual experience. However, Klein didn't have much confidence at that very moment. The power of the mysterious space was obviously higher than his spirituality, making him unable to smoothly control the power. As such, the power of the golden figure was mixed, chaotic, and insufficiently coordinated. If he used it as is, the effect was, at most, 10% of what he expected. As for Amon, who was suspected to be a descendant of the ancient sun god, he was born into a family of blasphemers in the Tudor Empire's fourth epoch. Even if it wasn't his main body, he was able to successfully hide his identity from the powerful high-sequence demon hunter and the powerful mystical items that protected the existence of the City of Silver. Klein truly didn't have much confidence with the effect only amounting to 10%. His initial plan was only to give it a try. If it really didn't work, he would temporarily bar the sun and then reconnect with him when he found a better solution. However, having come this far, Klein naturally wanted the best outcome and strived to succeed in one go. Having disguised himself as the godlike fool, he too had a little pride, and he wanted to keep up his reputation. He gave a self-deprecating laugh as he prepared to find a way to increase the effects of the golden figure to dispel the evil entity at the last moment. Of course, I can only waste a few seconds, otherwise, the ritual would be over. Klein's eyes swept over the items on the long bronze table again, thinking only of the words, high level. Due to his spirituality's intuition as a seer, his gaze landed on an item. The card of blasphemy, the Dark Emperor card. Of all the items Klein owned, it was the only one that matched the words, high level. As for Azek's copper whistle, Klein clearly remembered that it had been completely suppressed when the Blackthorn Security Company faced off with the spawn of the evil god. However, what the Dark Emperor card's high level pertains to is the knowledge contained inside. That's not right. After the owner advances to become a high-sequence Beyonder, it can produce subtle responses with the Beyonder ingredients that are needed. Furthermore, it also possesses the characteristics of anti-divination and anti-prophecy. In other words, its level isn't low. I don't need to use it for a fight, as long as I can use its high level to suppress the power of this mysterious space above the fog, and if I can minimize the chaotic and unnatural coordination of the golden figure, that will be enough. Klein quickly came up with an idea. He reached out his hand towards the Dark Emperor card, which had its back facing up. Just then, he noticed a frightening scene through the corner of his eyes. Within the shadow of the sun that was formed by the illusory rays of the crimson star, a palm, so shriveled that only skin and bones remained, was suddenly reaching forward. Slowly but firmly, it grabbed at the boundary of the crimson star, giving off a feeling as if it was piercing through reality and entering the psyche domain. Amon was attempting to use the connection to rip open the boundary and extend his hand into the gray fog. Whoosh! For the first time, the endless grayish-white fog was in chaos. The flowing from before seemed to turn into waves as gales formed. Klein's pupils shrank. He no longer hesitated, and he picked up the Dark Emperor card. As soon as he held this item in his hand, he immediately felt that his spirituality was no longer subdued by the power of the mysterious space. Suddenly, the golden figure became abnormally tall, and on its back, it grew pairs of enormous pitch-black wings. There were a total of 12 pairs. On each pair of wings, there were dark and bright feathers engraved with many mysterious symbols. The contrast between gold and black was stark, and the huge figure, driven by Klein, spread its wings to cover the vast dome of the towering palace. Without a sound, the sacred yet corrupted figure of light and darkness flashed overlapping with the manifestation of little sun that was formed by the crimson star. The light and shadows intersected, and a fierce wind blew in all directions. The palm that was so shriveled that it didn't have any flesh, to the point of only having skin and bones left, shrank backward uncontrollably, but it also firmly refused to retreat. It was like a man falling off a cliff who had extended his hand to grab a bulge, unwilling to let go regardless of what happened. Whoosh! In the midst of the illusory and chaotic sounds, light and darkness completely erupted. The shriveled hand finally lost its support, and it plummeted, constantly disintegrating and disappearing as it did. After a few seconds, the gray fog in the mysterious space above it returned to its previous tranquility, as if no one had stepped inside for thousands of years. Klein focused again and saw that the blurry figure of Little Sun was no longer entangled with the twisted and incorporeal entity. Phew! Unable to stop himself, he heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he conjured the contrasting image from before and threw them at the manifested figure of Little Sun in the crimson rays of light, allowing him to fully comprehend them. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek felt both awake and adrift at the same time. It was as if he could see shadows of ineffable shapes, different colors of light that contained endless knowledge, and a majestic, tall, golden figure looking down upon everything. This figure stood beside Mr. Fool in the thick gray fog, with 12 pairs of huge, dark, mysterious wings on his back. Not only did his body and mind become warm and pure, but he also seemed to understand what was called sunlight. He had even figured out holy water creation, as well as the knowledge to exorcise evil spirits. It also contained images he couldn't understand, such as a towering, hidden pyramidal mausoleum. In that intoxicating spiritual experience, it was as if he had returned to his most carefree childhood, to the lands where the sun shone in his imagination, and it was only when everything was gone and the simple furnishings of his room came into view that he snapped back to his senses. Is this the secret deed ritual as referenced in textbooks? For more than 2,000 years, no one in the City of Silver has succeeded before. No one has been able to come into contact with a mighty existence. At that moment, Derek's low spirits and loneliness lessened. A heartfelt smile beamed on his face. The Fool's so-called experiment was to confirm whether our City of Silver's environment can perform a secret deed ritual. That wondrous feeling of all that knowledge was the payment he gave me. Derek lowered his head again and said with great respect, "Thank you, Mr. Fool." Right at this moment, a grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of his eyes. In the center of the fog was a lofty chair. It was the leisurely seated fool. Then, Derek saw himself covered in a transparent, illusory shadow. The figure wore a black classic robe, a matching pointed hat, and a crystal monocle hung from its face. It coiled around his body like a python. This Amon wasn't dead. He evaded the detection of the mystical items and the attention of His Excellency, and he became a parasite on my spirit body. Derek's eyes widened, and he saw himself as he was now, no longer entangled by Amon. Did Mr. Fool notice him and finish him? Derek's sunken heart calmed down while cold sweat trickled down his forehead due to the lingering fear. His face, on the other hand, displayed an expression of instinctive reverence. He subconsciously followed the words described in the mythology course and said, "Praise you, the mighty Mr. Fool." Somewhere in the deep darkness, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the surroundings. This was a plain that was filled with ravines, and a dark green single-eyed giant was wandering about subconsciously. His eyes were lifeless, and his face was covered with traces of rotting pus. Grayish-yellow gas permeated from his body and interwoven in the air, forming many clouds. And beneath his feet, in the darkest ravine on the plain, there was a figure standing at the edge, overlooking the land below. With the help of the lightning, a thick and broad grayish-white building could be vaguely seen at the bottom of the ravine. The figure was dressed in a black classic robe and a pointed cap of the same color. It had curly black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and thin cheeks. It looked identical to the phantom Derek Berg had seen. He raised his hand and pinched the crystal monocle. Then, he turned his head to the left and looked into the distance. As expected, he suddenly whispered, in the language of ancient Fasak. After pausing for a moment, the man smiled and said the words, "The fool." Before he finished speaking, he had already jumped into the ravine in front of him. At this moment, the lightning subsided for a second, and darkness completely enveloped the world. After eliminating the fatal threat, Klein returned to the real world, once again feeling the urgent need to advance his sequence. The Amon that I eliminated wasn't the main body. If he truly is interested in the mysterious space above the gray fog, he will soon return to the City of Silver. At that time, I wonder if the 2 legendary mystical items and the 3 demon hunters will be able to stop him. For a mere clone to be so bizarre and terrifying, one can imagine how powerful his main body is. Therefore, I need to conclude the rest of the magician rules as soon as possible and, through digestion and advancement, better grasp the mysterious space above the gray. Perhaps, the City of Silver's shepherd elder will be used. If she really is corrupted by the true creator. Klein opened the bathroom door and went down to the first floor while in deep thought. Chapter 364, Cathedral of Serenity. What about the rest of the magician's rules? As Klein idly leafed through the newspaper he had finished reading, he thought about the issues that mattered most to him. He had already considered one point before, and that was the difference between having an audience to cheer for him and not having one. However, just this alone didn't seem sufficient. With this thought, Klein's thoughts ran wild as he inexplicably thought of something. When I was still a seer, being recognized and praised as a true fortune teller would give me a feeling that the process of digesting the magic potion had become faster. After I concluded the seer principles, I began to believe that there was no direct correlation between the views and feedback from others and that they were merely expressions, nothing substantial. If I act well enough, it would naturally be acknowledged, and my digestion would naturally be faster. That is to say, I had always believed that they were 2 different responses with the same gains, and not something related to causality. But now, there's the choice of receiving an audience's applause. If it does help me digest the potion, does it mean that some performances really require feedback, and the way that others view me can subtly affect the progress of my potion's digestion? By extension, would the establishment of the churches by the 7 Orthodox gods, the spreading of their faith, and the nurturing of their followers partially be a result of this? This is truly a sacrilegious thought. I am indeed not a person who sincerely worships gods. I will praise them, but I won't blindly believe in them. Klein quickly adjusted his train of thought as he searched for another angle of attack. He repeatedly compared the subtle differences between seer, clown, and magician. Gradually, he came up with an idea. In comparison, does a magician, who needs to perform, possess the need to take the initiative? Taking the initiative to perform instead of being passive like a seer or clown? From the perspective of fate, it also fits. From a seer's reverence of fate, a clown's characteristic of being teased by fate while still maintaining a smile, and finally a magician who takes the initiative to challenge fate. Even if the result is nothing real or substantial, he will still receive the audience's applause from his deception. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he planned to make attempts in taking the initiative to perform. Where should I start? It should be something relatively less dangerous. I can consider the imprisonment of that vampire named Emlyn White by Father Yutravsky. However, I need to confirm that this group of non-humans abide by the law and only engage in petty theft at the worst. Where do Emlyn's companions stay on the southern side of the bridge? I can't really remember. I'll have to use divination to jog my memories. I'll also confirm how dangerous it is. Having come to this conclusion, Klein put down the newspaper, got up, and went upstairs. It had to be said that he didn't have any other motivation to actively involve himself in something that had almost nothing to do with him. It wasn't his personality, but in order to act, he had to force himself to do so. This is considered rather simple for me. How would a straight male act as a witch and demoness of pleasure? It's no wonder the City of Silver emphasizes that you're only acting. Klein suddenly understood the meaning of the admonition. City of Silver, in a dark room at the top of the spire. Chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad, stood in front of a window, staring at the Silver City which was shrouded in darkness and lightning. Those beams of light illuminated his disheveled white hair, revealing his twisted and hideous old scars on his face, as well as the deep wrinkles on his face and his worried eyes. After an unknown period of time, Colin turned and looked at a dark corner. He asked in a deep voice, "Find anything?" In the corner, a shadow stood up. It was pitch black as it shot towards the wall, twisting and whirling. Its voice carried the feeling of metal rubbing against metal, and it was rather jarring to the ears. After Derek Berg returned home, he showed some signs of abnormality, but there was no immediate need to deal with it. Colin nodded slightly and said, "What did he do?" With the help of the mystical item at the bottom of the spire, the rampager and the clone of the mysterious figure were eliminated. However, he had constantly suspected that the matter had not been completely resolved. The former captain of the exploration team suddenly lost control. The mysterious person recklessly took action after enduring for a full 42 years, without any consideration for the traps or the consequences. All of this made Colin, who had killed and hunted many monsters, instinctively feel that something was amiss. Therefore, he believed that this was a deliberate choice made by the mysterious man. Although the real purpose of the mysterious man was still unknown, he definitely had some sort of follow-up method, and it wouldn't be so simple to get rid of him. After using his demon hunter powers and finding no abnormalities, he deliberately pretended to be deceived and directly permitted the youth named Derek Berg to return home. However, he had secretly sent someone to monitor the situation closely. This was completely different from the detention and observation method which Colin had used in the past. It was a change he had no choice but to make. The black shadow that was slightly gyrating replied. After he entered the room, he sat on the edge of the bed and muttered to himself for quite a while. As I was afraid that the mysterious man would discover me, I didn't get too close, so I couldn't clearly hear what was being said. However, I can confirm that this is an abnormal sign. After talking to himself, Derek seemed to become very tired and fell asleep very quickly. But after a short nap, he suddenly woke up and conducted a ritual. I suspect that his mind wasn't lucid while doing so and that he was controlled by the mysterious man. By the way, the ritual had elements of a secret deed. Colin pondered for a while and said with a solemn expression, as expected. Perhaps he was communicating with his main body via this method. What exactly is his purpose? Why did he spend his 42 years at the bottom of the spire in peace? The Black Shadow naturally couldn't answer this question as it continued. After the ritual, Derek no longer showed any abnormal behavior. Does this matter need to be dealt with immediately? If that mysterious person's main body is attracted here, we might not be able to deal with him. Colin remained silent for a few seconds before saying, continue the observation. That mysterious person has yet to show any substantial malice, so our reaction can't be too intense. Sigh, do you remember that prophecy? It's almost time for disaster to befall. The further we explore, the more strange ruins we find, and the more dangerous the items we harvest. By your will, your excellency. The Black Shadow slowly retreated back into the ground and disappeared. At this moment, in the Berg household, Derek began to cough so violently that his heart seemed to almost burst. Cough. 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 He crouched down and coughed non-stop until his throat began to itch, and he coughed out something. Splat. A translucent object slid across his throat and fell to the ground. It was a worm with the length and thickness of a finger. There were some transparent areas on its body, forming rings. Derek had seen something like this at the bottom of the spire previously, and he was certain that he was already free of Amon's influence. He bent down and picked up the translucent worm, and finally, he was able to count the total number of rings on its body. There were a total of 12. What is its use? What can it be used for? It seems to be dead. Derek lost himself in thought. Winter County in the northern part of the Lone Kingdom. A black Gothic cathedral towered over the snow-covered mountains as it occupied a vast stretch of land. In front of it was a cliff, and its surroundings was a vast expanse of whiteness with utmost silence. This was the Church of the Evernight Goddess's headquarters, known as the Cathedral of Serenity. The dark-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell had a black windbreaker draped over him as he wore red gloves and walked out of his room. Having successfully advanced and stabilized himself, he hadn't been given the opportunity to participate in any operations yet, as well as some exercises and so-called mysticism courses. After going around a corner, Leonard saw a staircase leading down. There, he saw Captain Dunn Smith, with a pair of dark gray eyes and dressed in a black windbreaker, and Klein Moretti, who exuded a bookish demeanor standing there, smiling and waiting. He tilted his head back and sighed. My memory has also gotten worse. I've already forgotten that the two of you no longer exist. Leonard looked away and walked down the stairs to the first floor of the cathedral. He knocked on the door and entered a small room. There were chairs in the room, and some nighthawks wearing red gloves sat around inside. Leonard found a seat at random and sat down, smiling as he chatted with his friends. After a while, the high-ranking deacon, Christet Sesamir, with his propped-up collar covering his chin and lips, walked in, sat right in front, and said to the crowd, today's class will inform you of things you need to pay attention to. As Red Gloves, you will travel to different places, and there's a high chance of encountering dangerous high-sequence beyonders. If their intent is obvious, and they want to kill you, the only thing you can do is leave a trail behind you so that the subsequent investigators will be able to find the appropriate clues. The exact methods include. But most of the time, high-sequence beyonders won't always attack you directly. They will utilize you based on all sorts of factors. You must be alert enough to not be fooled, and here are a few things that we have summarized. Sitting in the back, Leonard listened with a smile and great attentiveness. His target for revenge was a high-sequence beyonder. Sesamir paused for 2 seconds and continued, in the first case, some high-sequence beyonder will pretend to be hidden existences, using promises and hope to deceive you into reciting his corresponding description. In the second case, some high-sequence beyonders might be restrained in a sealed state. They will act as mystical items that can help you get out of your predicament. For example, a magic lamp that can grant you 3 wishes or a wishing pond. The third case is for a high-sequence potion named Parasite. They often claim that they have lost their bodies and can only survive together with your spirit body. They can only rely on you and will not harm you. They will then give you knowledge, formulas, and all sorts of benefits, hoping that you can become powerful so that you can one day help him reconstruct his body or take revenge. In reality, the Beyonders with parasites will only become nutrients for the parasite, thus prolonging the parasite's lifespan and condition. As Leonard listened, his smile faded. Chapter 365, Vampire with a unique hobby. The Cathedral of Serenity looked particularly beautiful at night. It complemented with the crimson moon high up in the sky that coldly illuminated the land. Leonard entered his single room, took off his 2 red gloves, and tossed them onto a wooden table. With a grim look, he sat in front of the patterned glass window, his back facing out as he bathed in the moonlight. After 10 seconds of silence, he said softly, almost gritting his teeth, "So you're a parasite." Leonard's voice echoed faintly in his own ears, muffled by obvious anger, tension, a sense of loss, and fear. In the blink of an eye, a slightly aged voice resounded in his mind. "You can say that. What exactly do you want? Are you a being that's leeching my life through your parasitic means? Or are you waiting for me to become stronger, so you can directly devour my Beyonder characteristic, just like cultivating a humanoid potion?" Leonard's voice was suppressed, but in no way slow. The slightly aged voice in his mind laughed. "I'm your fortuitous encounter, didn't you always think so? You believe yourself to be unique and the protagonist of this era. In fact, you aren't acting as arrogant and self-conceited as you usually do. Ultimately, you're wary of me. Hee hee. After I taught you the acting method, you didn't even focus on studying it. All you did was a very superficial attempt at it. You wasted a very long time before you digested it and even hid it. You didn't pursue the nightmare potion. It was only after you met with the spawn of the true creator and suffered a setback were you willing to advance to sequence 7. Your regret has made you hallucinate. Leonard, think about it carefully. Would I not understand the Church of the Evernight Goddess? When I dealt with them, even the so-called Cheneys hadn't even been born yet. Would I not know that the Church of the Evernight Goddess knows of parasites? Would I not realize that the Red Gloves would grasp certain secrets to prevent the infiltration of high-sequence Beyonders? But did I ever stop you from joining the Red Gloves? After a few brief changes in expression, Leonard finally fell silent, saying nothing. The voice in his mind laughed again. Do you feel like you have aged faster than your real age? No, right? I can live for at least another 100 years. I'm not in a hurry to take over my host's life. As for your Beyonder characteristics, humph. We aren't even in a similar pathway that allows exchanging. If I swallow it, it would be equivalent to drinking poison, making me half crazy and increasing my chance of losing control. Do you think that I would do that? Evernight is grouped with Giant and Death, while my Beyonder pathway's goal is that of the Apprentice and Seer. Leonard looked at his body, which was illuminated by the crimson moonlight. After some thought, he asked again, what exactly do you want to do? What is your purpose? The slightly aged voice in his mind sighed. Didn't I already tell you? I've suffered tremendous damage, and I need a host to recover slowly, and I have to hide from a terrible enemy. The Nighthawks, the Church of the Evernight Goddess, is quite a good choice for a host. Leonard lifted his head, looked at the ceiling for a few seconds, and said in a deep voice, will you be discovered by the archbishops, high-ranking deacons, or other sealed artifacts? The slightly aged voice replied leisurely, if parasites were so easily discovered, that high-ranking deacon named Sesamir wouldn't have just given a warning and not send all of you to be checked. Of course, parasites do leave traces. The Church of the Evernight Goddess has the means to determine this, but it's relatively complicated and troublesome. It will cause certain losses and substantial danger. It might even affect that goddess, so before you become a high-ranking deacon, making you qualified to participate in meetings for the upper echelons of the church, and interact with Grade 0 sealed artifacts, there's no need to worry. By then, I should have recovered and embarked on my own journey. Leonard listened with a serious expression. After a while, he said, you have a terrifying enemy? Who is he? The slightly aged voice chuckled and said, I don't know his name, but I do know his last name. What is it? Leonard asked. The slightly aged voice suddenly became low and deep. Amon. The area south of the bridge, 46 River Bay Avenue. The owners of the house that were enjoying their dinner heard the tinkling of the doorbell. The only maid came to the door, and through the peephole above the door's lock, she saw a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform. She opened the door and asked somewhat fearfully, "Sir, is there anything I can do for you?" The cop was none other than the disguised Klein, who was attempting to take the initiative to perform. He was here to confirm that the partners of the vampire, Emlyn White, the ones living at 48 River Bay Avenue, and the people who entrusted Stewart with the mission, were law-abiding monsters. Yes, law-abiding monsters. Although this doesn't sound right and sounds a little funny, it's how I would react with my true thoughts. Klein emphasized in his heart. The police uniform he wore wasn't a fake that he specially tailored. It was a product of his ordinary clothes and hallucinatory effects. A magician had to do what a magician would do. Klein didn't monitor 48 River Bay Avenue because he believed that Emlyn White's companions had long since moved away. As monsters and non-humans, moving to another residence was the most basic thing to do after a comrade disappears for several days. They had to suspect that Emlyn White was captured by the Nighthawks, the mandated Punishers, or other official Beyonder organizations, and it was necessary to assume that he might be dead at any moment. Therefore, what Klein wanted to do was to perform an investigation by conducting a survey. He maintained the arrogance of a low-ranking policeman towards an ordinary citizen. Without taking off his hat, he slightly raised his chin and said, "I have something to ask your master." The maid entered in a fluster and quickly brought back a man in his 30s wearing a thick shirt. "Officer, what would you like to ask me?" the man asked nervously. Klein stood at the door and looked inside. "Do you know the residents of Unit 48? "I do." The male owner was stunned for a moment before asking, "What happened to them?" "They're involved in a case." "You have to tell me everything you know," Klein said with a straight face. His face was also disguised, augmented with slight hallucinatory effects. It was to ensure that he looked distinct from the great detective Sherlock Moriarty. The male owner suddenly came to a realization. It's no wonder they moved away so hurriedly more than a month ago. Most of the residents of River Bay Avenue and the neighborhood knew the Whites and their son. He was a handsome but eccentric young man. Mr. White is an excellent physician and is good at using all kinds of medicine and bloodletting therapy. Bloodletting therapy? Klein returned with a question. Yes, although this has been regarded by many newspapers and magazines as an old medical skill that had no effect, anyone who received Mr. White's treatment were cured. However, Mr. White also said that except for him, the other doctors who practice bloodletting therapy are quacks. The owner gave his viewpoint. The bloodletting therapy is to accumulate food for themselves, isn't it? The only thing that is useful was the medicine. This vampire family relied on bloodletting therapy to help treat patients while receiving food as compensation. If there weren't many patients, or if their blood was very unhealthy, would they consider going to a distant hospital to steal blood from a blood bag and drink it? For such monsters, they really are law-abiding. Klein nodded in understanding. The emotional color changes in his spirit vision told him that the man wasn't lying. Seeing that the police officer didn't refute him, the man continued, "Mr. White and his wife are very nice people. Although they can't cure those who are seriously ill, they're still pretty good doctors for all the residents who live nearby." Was their child, Emlyn, involved in a case? That young man was too silent, as though he looked down on us. He's always hiding at home, and I have no idea what he's doing. Officer, are you hot? It's so cold outside. He probably just hides in the day and comes out at night. Klein wiped the sweat off his forehead and said, "I've been walking around here all day because of this case." Next, according to his design survey, he learned everything about the Whites and their son. One family at a time, he knocked on the door, asked questions, compiled answers, and came to the conclusion that the White family was indeed kind, amiable, and law-abiding. It doesn't seem like a description of a vampire. Klein looked up at the crimson moon which was piercing through the clouds, ready to make a final confirmation. He removed the hallucinatory effect from his body and started divining. After making sure there was no danger, he went around to the side and climbed into the house at 48 River Bay Avenue. Others might not know who had taken Emlyn White away, ultimately afraid of being followed up by an official visit from official Beyonders. But Klein knew what was going on and wasn't worried about a trap. As he entered the second floor, he used the moonlight to see that the rooms were in disarray. Many things hadn't been taken away. Through these things, he could imagine the haste in which their owners had left. He even found some precious books on herbs in a study, including some popular countryside folk recipes. As he walked, Klein entered one of the bedrooms, and shadows came into view. He jumped in fright, imagining that he had been ambushed. He almost snapped his fingers to light the match that had been thrown outside. Fortunately, no attacks occurred. The crimson moonlight shone through the window, covering the entire room. Klein was finally able to clearly see what those black shadows were. They didn't have any spiritual luster, and they were figurines of varying sizes. The biggest one was only slightly shorter than Klein. It was a girl wearing a gorgeous long skirt. Her sleeves and collars were covered with lace and ribbons. This female figurine was obviously more like one of wax. Her facial features were vivid and lifelike, and her golden hair and red eyes were alluring and beautiful. The smallest one was only the size of a normal person's palm. It was a woman wearing silver body armor. She looked valiant and heroic while looking magnanimous and beautiful. As his eyes swept past each figurine, Klein suddenly remembered something. Under the influence of Roselle, the development of figurine art had two trends. One was the adorable type, allowing them to have a change of clothes, while the other strove to be more realistic. Klein looked around and couldn't help but exclaim, "These figurines are not cheap." Don't tell me Emlyn is a vampire who is obsessed with figurines? Chapter 366, The Hanged Man's Ambition. After a thorough inspection, Klein confirmed that there was nothing odd about the White family and that the couple didn't even leave a single strand of hair behind, apparently to prevent anyone from tracking them down using divination. He returned to the bedroom filled with dolls, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog, intending to use divination for a final confirmation. However, before he got down to business, he conjured the female figurine who was nearly his height, and just like how he had done a divination for the mutated sun's sacred emblem in Tingen City, he picked up a dark red fountain pen and wrote a sentence on the yellowish-brown goatskin, its origin. Putting down the pen and holding onto the piece of paper, Klein leaned back in his chair and began to mumble as he slowly adjusted his mental state into a cogitation state. After repeating this 7 times, his eyes turned dark, and his eyelids drooped as he entered a deep slumber. In the gray space, he saw the puppet craftsman working with extraordinary concentration. He saw the red-eyed girl being placed in the room of dolls and Emlyn White fishing out his wallet with his eyes fixed on her. Finally, the scene stopped inside the bedroom where Klein was presently located. The proud vampire, Emlyn White, with his hair combed back diagonally, looked handsome but slightly delicate. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the doll affectionately, along with all the other puppets of different sizes. He truly is a fanatic of figurines. Klein opened his eyes and face-bombed. Soon after, he waved his hand, causing the puppet that he conjured to vanish from the space above the gray fog. When he was done, he picked up his fountain pen again and wrote another divination statement, "Scenes of death in the last 10 years in 48 River Bay Avenue." According to the statements from the residents, the White family had been there for no more than 10 years, so Klein was able to lock onto a specific area, and he believed that if the White family were just superficially good monsters who were actually making disappearance cases all the time in order to suck warm, delicious blood, then it was impossible to not have any happen at home. In a period as long as 10 years, there would always be a few accidents as long as they didn't stop. After carefully checking the divination sentence, Klein recited it and entered cogitation again, rapidly falling into a dream. In the dusky world, his vision was sometimes pitch black, sometimes dotted with snowflakes, and sometimes splintered. However, no scenes appeared. This was the result of the divination, nothing. No one had died in the last 10 years at 48 River Bay Avenue. By taking into account all the factors involved, it's possible to make a preliminary conclusion that the White family was a law-abiding vampire family, other than a few instances of petty theft. As Klein looked at the long, mottled bronze table in front of him, he wrapped himself with his spirituality and plummeted into the gray fog. Returning to the real world, he carefully removed the traces he had left behind and left 48 River Bay Avenue. Instead of making his final conclusion, he took a detour to the River Bay police station, where he easily sneaked into the archives by mixing himself in among the thieves and drunkards, allowing them to serve as a foil for his disguise. There, he boldly lit the gas lamps inside. Then, Klein pulled out the last 10 years of missing persons records and paged through them. From time to time, the police officers on duty would pass by the door, but their eyes didn't notice any light leaking out from the archives. There's nothing suspicious at all. After an unknown period of time, the black-gloved Klein placed the docket back. Then, he turned off the gas lamp, took off his hat in the darkness, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed towards the lobby. On his way back to Minsk Street, Klein took a shower, changed his clothes, sat down at his desk, and spread out the map of Backlund that he had first bought on the steam locomotive. The first thing he did was find Rose Street, which was on the south side of the bridge where the Harvest Church was located. This was where Father Yutravsky was the bishop of the cathedral and had Emlyn White imprisoned in his basement. Soon after, Klein's gaze moved as he familiarized himself with the names and layout of the surrounding streets. A performance can't be done too hastily or with an excessive thirst for success. One has to slowly immerse the audience into the act. Klein whispered, unfolding a piece of paper and lowering his pen. Dear Detective Stewart, I wonder if you found Emlyn White? I've been keeping an eye out for you lately, and one of my informants told me today that he has seen this man on Tativa Street in the area south of the bridge. Of course, he simply said that the person he saw looked similar to the man in the portrait. Putting down the pen, Klein folded the letter neatly, stuffed it into an envelope, and affixed a black stamp worth 1 penny. Above the vast, boundless Sonia sea with undulating waves churning beneath it. The Blue Avenger advanced forward steadily without any signs of shaking. Alger Wilson sat in the captain's cabin with a brass sextant in his hand, but his eyes were closed. Without a sound, a smile suddenly appeared on his face. I've finally digested it. Alger opened his eyes and raised his hands, causing the surroundings to glow with an azure light. The azure lights intersected and turned into a huge wave that swept forward. Alger pressed his hands together, and the wave disintegrated, turning into countless raindrops that fell onto the deck. After nearly 4 months, his seafarer potion had finally been digested. During this period of time, not only had he spent a long time wandering the seas, completing all the missions assigned to him by the church, but he had also deliberately sought out new sea routes and sought out undiscovered islands. After a few setbacks, he was finally met with success. This, in turn, led to the digestion of the potion, allowing him to figure out his principles as a seafarer. The core principle involved being intimate with the sea, to masterfully grasp information regarding sea routes and the weather, as well as exploration and discovery. The always heavy Alger couldn't help getting out of his seat. He paced back and forth in the captain's cabin, thinking of the future he longed for. After obtaining the potion formula for the Wind-Blessed and finding the corresponding Beyonder ingredients, he would hide his advancement to Sequence 6 from the church. Then, he would repeat the same process again, striving to become a Sequence 5 ocean songster within 3 years. During this process, he had to serve as the captain of the Blue Avenger and avoid entering the mandated Punishers with its complicated social relationship so as to prevent his secret from being exposed. Once I'm promoted to Sequence 5 and gain sufficient strength, I'll be able to secretly return to that place. Alger subconsciously looked to his right. His gaze seemed to pierce through the planks of the ship and the vast sea, and onto an ancient and hidden island. Alger wasn't worried about his future advancement within the church. Once he fulfilled his wishes, he would be able to fully focus on seeking a higher position in the church. At that time, he would continue to disguise himself as a Sequence 7 despite being a Sequence 5 and drink another Wind-Blessed potion. This would increase his Beyonder characteristics, strengthen him, and slow his digestion, but it wouldn't endanger his own safety. For the same reason, after Sequence 5 was completely digested, he could imbibe another ocean songster and repeat the normal process. This would only push him closer to losing control, but he also had solutions to that. It was to find a woman to marry and transfer the extra Beyonder characteristics to his children. After doing this, I'll be able to move closer to the level of a cardinal and approach the level of a high sequence Beyonder. This is my chance in such an era. In his mind, Alger had already sketched out the image of himself wearing the robe of a cardinal as he occupied a high position in the church and had many mandated punishers under his control. After being intoxicated for a moment, he withdrew his gaze and regained his senses. What follows will increase in difficulty with each step. Fortunately, I have the tarot gathering and Mr. Fool. Although there are dangers underlying it as well, any path to improving myself will involve risk. I have to try to gather those Roselle diary pages as quickly as possible. I should grab the chance to raise a question and understand what that card beside Mr. Fool's hand is, the one which only shows its back. It wasn't there previously. Card. Roselle's diary. Could it be the item I'm thinking of? Alger's eyes narrowed as his pupils constricted. 15 Minsk Street. Klein yawned, switched off the gas lamp, and slipped into bed. He originally had another plan. He had wanted to use divination to grasp the origin of the biological poison bottle and obtain the first 3 potion formulas for the sequence from the werewolf Beyonder characteristic. But after a busy night dealing with the matter regarding Emlyn White, he felt a little tired and decided to try again the next day above the gray fog. Just as he lay down and closed his eyes, Klein suddenly felt that something was wrong. This was the spiritual intuition of a seer. It has already been several days since I obtained the werewolf Beyonder characteristics and the biological poison bottle. It's not like I haven't been in a good mental state during this period of time, yet, I have been repeatedly delaying the divination. This is very abnormal. Klein sat up, carefully thought about it, and recalled a similar incident. The first time he met Megos, he had wanted to directly use his spirit vision to observe her mental state, but he naturally ended up missing the opportunity due to momentarily being taken aback. It was only at the end that he found out that it was because Megos had an evil god spawn in her stomach. His spiritual intuition as a seer had stopped him without leaving a mark, preventing him from losing control and collapsing right on the spot. It's very similar, and this time, it's even more obvious. I remember that Miss Sharon mentioned at the Rose School of Thought's control over their members far exceeds my imagination. Everyone's body and soul seem to be bound by something, which is also the reason why information regarding the mutant sequence is rarely leaked out. They believe in the chained god. So, when using the Beyonder characteristic of a werewolf to deduce the corresponding potion formulas, it would directly involve this evil god and bring about consequences that I don't wish to bear? Klein thought about it seriously and felt that there was something suspicious about it. Back when I divined the mutated sun sacred emblem and the gear left behind by the listener, my spiritual intuition hadn't stopped me. Could it be that the chained god is stronger than the eternal blazing sun and the true creator? Or could it be that his nature allows him to restrain the gray fog and even be able to effectively invade it? Of course, the source of the danger can also be the biological poison bottle. Thinking of this, Klein, who was always cautious, decided to attempt divining the biological poison bottle tomorrow and see if his seer's spiritual intuition would stop him. Chapter 367, Threatening Letter. Tuesday morning, the weather remained as cold as it usually was this season. Klein tightened the collar of his tweed coat, put on his hat, and pulled open the door. He was heading to the end of the street, where the mailbox was, to post a letter to Detective Stewart. Since it wasn't that far, there was no need to dress neatly or heavily, but Klein had just recovered from his cold, so he had wrapped himself up thickly just in case. Perhaps it was because of the strong wind last night, but the air in Backlund was surprisingly good. Klein subconsciously slowed down his pace and enjoyed this rare morning. As he passed Jürgen's house, he heard the oriel window creak open and instinctively turned to look. Standing at the window was Mrs. Doris, wearing a black plush hat and a thick grayish-blue scarf. She looked even worse than before, and her body was even more hunched. "Good morning, Detective Moriarty. Thank you for taking care of Brody. He said you were a good man, didn't you, Brody?" Old Granny Doris bent down and picked up the black cat with green eyes. Brody used all 4 of his limbs and struggled in her embrace. Finally, he jumped down and lightly landed on the windowsill. But instead of leaving, he circled around and around, nuzzling Mrs. Doris with its head on one side, without even looking at Klein. Was he being friend-zoned by a cat? Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh and smiled sincerely. "It's a happy deed, and even more delightful news is that you've recovered and have been discharged from the hospital." After exchanging a few pleasantries, he said goodbye and continued to walk down the street with a smile on his face. He had only taken a few steps when he heard Mrs. Doris call after him. "When Jürgen comes back, I'll have him pay you." "Do I look like I took this mission for the money?" The smile on Klein's face suddenly froze. He could only half turn around and wave his hand, indicating that he understood. When he was far away from Jürgen's house, his expression gradually turned serious, and he sighed faintly. He had just activated his spirit vision to look at Mrs. Doris's aura and found that her situation wasn't too good. It wasn't only because of her old age but also because of the cold weather and bad air in Backlund. All of these had a very bad effect on her lung disease. Mrs. Doris should be able to make it through this late autumn and winter, but it will be hard to say for the next one, or the next one. If she wants to live for a few more years, she would have to move to the south, to the area around Desi Bay. It's a pity that it's likely that lawyer Jürgen can't afford to do so now. "Even I haven't been to Desi Bay." Klein mumbled, came to the mailbox, and stuffed the letter in. This was the prelude to his performance. And this evening, he would head to the Harvest Church as a detective and do the rest of the preparations. After buying a Desi pie for breakfast, Klein returned via his original path and was quite at ease. Before he got close to the house, he saw an elegantly decorated carriage parked outside. 2 ladies in black hats and a ribbon were anxiously pulling on his doorbell, while the maids and bodyguards were scattered around, as though they were on guard against something. "Mrs. Stellan." "Ma'am Mary. Do they have something to entrust me with?" "They look very anxious." With the paper bag containing the Desi pie in hand, Klein approached and said with a laugh, "Ladies, it should be time for breakfast." When they turned back to see Detective Sherlock Moriarty, Ma'am Mary was visibly relieved. "Mr. Detective, you have to help me." In Klein's spirit vision, there was nothing fake about her anxiety, nervousness, and fear. Therefore, he nodded his head, pointed at the door and said, "Let's talk inside." As he spoke, he glanced at his landlady, Stellan, and he noticed that her condition was entirely different from the past 2 days. She had become very low and dejected, as though she wasn't interested in anything at all. What happened to her? Although his landlady liked to show off a little, she's someone who loves life a lot. Klein took out his key and opened the door. After entering, before she could sit still, Ma'am Mary impatiently said, "Detective Moriarty, I received a threatening letter." "Threatening letter?" Klein put down the Desi pie, clasped his hands and asked, "What does the letter say?" Ma'am Mary glanced sideways at Mrs. Stellan, and seeing that she wasn't quite as active as usual, she said after some deliberation, "That letter asked me to handle the smoke of the factory impartially when I carry out the atmospheric pollution investigation and to acknowledge their contributions, or else I would end up like the doll that came with the letter." The doll's head was ripped off, and its arms and legs were broken. Ma'am Mary seemed to recall the feeling when she opened the letter, and she said with a trembling voice, "This is the first time I've encountered something like this. I don't know if it will become a reality or not. I didn't know that I would have to experience such cases when I became a member of the Investigation Council. I didn't know, ma'am, perhaps Emperor Roselle once said that there are only 2 ultimate forms of hatred between people. One is to murder the other person's parents, and the other is to destroy another person's means of earning money." Klein solemnly nodded his head and said, "My suggestion is to report it to the police." From his point of view, Ma'am Mary was now a member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. Her status was completely different from before, and the police would certainly not take the threats she received lightly. Moreover, this involved the development of a governmental policy and wasn't an ordinary matter, so there was a high probability that the police department would hand the case over to the church's Biyao organization in order to solve this case as soon as possible. Based on Ma'am Mary's status as a follower of the goddess, the Nighthawks was an inevitable choice. This way, even if Klein wanted a share of the reward, he didn't want to involve himself in it. "I've already done so, but it doesn't reassure me." Ma'am Mary pursed her lips and said, "Do you know what they said?" "They said that threatening letters were formed by cutting the words from newspapers, and the doll could be bought from anywhere. It would be very difficult to find the sender in a short period of time. And they only sent one policeman to protect me." "Goddess, is this how they treat a helpless citizen's cry for help?" Ma'am Mary paused, looked earnestly at Klein and said, "Detective Moriarty, I believe you can help me, not only because of your performance from that matter but also because of Mike's approval, Aaron's praise, and Talam's extolment. And I know you made a great contribution in that serial murder case. Don't worry, I will pay you well enough. Your words make me happy, but something doesn't seem right. Unless the police have already been bribed, they would probably transfer the case to the Nighthawks, and with beyonder means such as divination available, it would be impossible for a letter made up of words from a newspaper to avoid detection. The sender would have either been caught already, or they would have means to interfere with divination. The latter would only lead to a formal and large-scale intervention by the Nighthawks. No matter what the situation is, it will be different from how the situation is handled now." Klein didn't answer Ma'am Mary right away, but he carefully analyzed the abnormality of this matter. The living room suddenly became unusually quiet. The feeling of silence made Ma'am Mary and Mrs. Stellan somewhat uneasy for some unknown reason. At some point in time, Klein had fished out a coin and made it bounce and roll between his fingers, as though it were a habit of his to focus his thoughts. Suddenly, the coin flew up and then fell down steadily onto the palm of his hand, its back facing up. Klein was surprised. He was divining whether this matter involved danger, but it turned out to have none. If such a threat really exists, even if the sender doesn't have considerable abilities, it would still result in a certain degree of danger. It's impossible to have none. Is it just a simple threat? Or... Klein suddenly thought of another possibility as he smiled and said, "Ma'am Mary, don't worry. You can go back home in peace. If someone comes to you in the next 2 days to discuss this issue so as to make it public, allowing the citizens to know the true intentions of those factory owners in order to incite anger among the public, then you will be fine." The possibility which Klein had just thought of was that the threat was a trap set up by the council so as to incite the public to use their anger, allowing the atmospheric pollution investigation to be carried out smoothly and lead to the subsequent bill which could benefit them. This would explain why the police are responding in this manner. "Why do you say that?" Ma'am Mary asked, frowning. Klein smiled and replied, "That's what I've deduced." "And if what you claim doesn't happen in 2 days?" Ma'am Mary pressed. Klein said sincerely, "Then I will provide protection. In any case, there's no danger," he added inwardly. After comforting and sending off Ma'am Mary, he went above the grey fog to confirm the matter and received the same result as before. By then, his desi pie had turned cold. Ma'am Mary returned home with some apprehension and uneasiness, wondering if she should invite Stellan to stay with her for a few days. At that moment, her housekeeper informed her that the eldest son of Count Hall, the chief secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, Mr. Hibbert Hall, had come. After both of them entered the living room, before Ma'am Mary could even open her mouth to speak, the handsome, blonde gentleman spoke first. "Ma'am Mary, I've heard of what has happened to you. It's a disgrace to Backlund, and even to the whole kingdom, and I'm deeply sorry for it. Don't worry, everyone in the committee will stand with you." "Thank you for your concern," Ma'am Mary responded gratefully. After a moment of consideration, Hibbert Hall said, "Ma'am, I wish to get a reporter to interview you regarding this incident. I want to tell everyone about what happened to you and how despicable this act is. I want to let everyone see how outrageous those people who have contaminated Backlund's air are. There's no sign of repentance. Please agree to my request. It's exactly as Detective Moriarty described. Ma'am Mary was momentarily at a loss for words. After breakfast, Klein rested for a while. Since he had nothing better to do, he went above the gray fog in preparation to divine the origin of the biological poison bottle. This time, he didn't delay it at all. Chapter 368. Taking him by surprise, the stone pillars of the ancient and majestic palace supported the high dome. Klein sat at the end of the long bronze table, holding a translucent brown bottle. He checked it over and over again, but he didn't sense any danger from it. Let's begin. He conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination statement, its origin. Putting the fountain pen away and bracing himself for a blow, Klein glanced at the paper and the biological poison bottle, leaned back in his chair, and entered cogitation while reciting the statement. Soon, he entered a hazy gray dream world and saw a dark but spacious room. There were king cobras, black widows, and other strange plants and animals in the room. It was a messy and harrowing scene. A middle-aged man in a white coat was standing in front of a long table in the middle of the room. He threw the snake gall and spider venom into the huge black pot that hung from the ceiling. In the end, he even put in a few items that possessed a strong spiritual luster. For example, they would sometimes disperse into a black gas, and other times condense into dark green lung-shaped objects. Otherwise, they would be in the form of a tube containing a clear azure liquid or fiery red eyes. The air around the black iron pot gradually became viscous. It was gathering towards the center, but it was constantly being pushed aside, making it difficult to achieve its goal. When the white-robed middle-aged man saw this scene, his brows slowly creased, his expression looked slightly anxious. He flipped through the black notebook by his side, gritted his teeth, and used a ritual silver dagger to slice open his wrist. Drops of fresh blood dripped into the black iron pot, seemingly breathing life into its contents instantly. A terrifying suction force suddenly erupted, sucking in all the viscous air around it. The scarlet blood which had yet to leave his wrist was fully sucked into it. And that wasn't everything. Regardless of how the white-robed middle-aged man struggled to resist, or how he revealed a terrified expression, he couldn't prevent his body from approaching the iron pot. His body was stretched, his head was compressed, and amidst his screams, he was eaten, little, by the pot. The hanging specimens, plants, and anything that could move or be moved, all flew into the pot. Brown fog suddenly filled the room, quietly ebbing and flowing. By the time it was all over, the room was empty except for the brown, translucent bottle lying quietly in the middle of the clearing. The scene quickly faded away, and the dream world shattered. Klein opened his eyes and muttered to himself, so the biological poison bottle is a product of a death-seeking experiment. I thought it was a Beyonder characteristic left behind by some Beyonder. If that were the case, I'd have been able to divine a formula. To Klein, a rampager spirituality and Beyonder characteristic, as well as a spirituality and Beyonder characteristic which was contaminated by an evil god, could all be used to divine a formula. Just like the all-black eye which Nimblewright Master Rosago left behind. It was thanks to the isolation effects of the gray fog, and how the mysterious space was able to eliminate negative influences, giving him the ability to court death. Of course, a Beyonder characteristic involved many other additional factors. In theory, the chances of failure were extremely high, but Klein only had the confidence to do so after advancing to magician. Similarly, a sealed artifact formed by Beyonder characteristics could also be used to divine the formula for a potion. However, if they were mainly ingredients, then through the production processes and dangerous experiments done by an artisan or other Beyonders, turning them into mystical items, then Klein's divination would be useless at his current state. Even with the enhancement effect provided by the mysterious space above the gray fog, it was useless. Not bad. At least I don't have to worry about the biological poison bottle having any other latent risks anymore. Klein glanced at the werewolf Fong and wisely abandoned his curiosity. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall, Audrey continued her study of psychology. By her feet, the huge golden retriever, Susie, was sitting there, her eyes shining. From time to time, she wagged her tail, as if enjoying the scene. Psychiatrist Escalante finished the introduction material and deliberately made a casual remark. Actually, there is such a theory. It's believed that humans would inherit a certain amount of their ancestors' consciousness over the generations, thus, forming the underlying logic of one's behavior patterns. For example, although many people have never seen a poisonous snake, they would instinctively feel afraid and wish to avoid it once they encounter one. Why is that? This is theorized to be an instinct that we inherited from our ancestors, something that is hidden in the deepest recesses of our consciousness. In ancient times, people constantly fought with poisonous snakes and all kinds of ferocious animals, and they gradually carved this memory into their consciousness and passed it down. How does it get passed down? Audrey asked with interest. Escalante, with her long hair which reached her waist, laughed. That's a very good question. Some people provide explanations that involve a theory that everyone's consciousness is actually connected at the lowest level. It is one entity, and the traces and characteristics left behind on this entity will affect the consciousness that belongs solely to them. For example, the lowest level of consciousness is like an endless ocean. Our unique consciousness would be the island situated in the ocean and can be split into two parts. One is hidden under the water, which is the subconscious, which is higher in both quantity and size. The other is exposed on the surface of the ocean, the superficial consciousness that can usually be detected. This is the axiom of this school of thought in psychology. Audrey glanced at Susie, stroked the golden fur on its neck and said, "So, we can use this connected ocean to influence the consciousness of others and achieve the goal of curing certain mental illnesses? This is the mysticism foundation and beyonder powers of a psychiatrist. But it doesn't seem enough and is lacking something. For example, the sky above one's head, the sky which shrouds everything?" Audrey curiously thought as she wore a look of confused enlightenment. "You're really talented in this area," Escalante praised in delight. "However, we can only affect a portion of the surrounding ocean, and through it, we can affect those who are close to us. If we venture deeper into the ocean, it will be easy for us to lose ourselves." She looked up at the ornate and complicated clock on the wall, smiled, and said, "Time's up, this is the end of today's class. Miss Audrey, if you're interested in this psychological school of thought, then we can continue talking about it next time." "All right." Audrey stood up and bowed. Watching Escalante leave, she nodded and thought. Ma'am Escalante doesn't seem like a real psychiatrist. At most, she's like me, a telepathist. Was what she just talked about the axioms of the psychology alchemists? They really are patient. Why aren't they trying to recruit me yet? As Audrey was in thought, Susie commented happily from the side, "Audrey, I feel like she's the same type of person as us." "No, I mean the same type of dog." "No, that's not right." "Woof." Susie, who only had a rudimentary grasp of the human language, fell into a state of confusion, unable to find the right words to describe her feelings. South of the bridge, Rose Street, outside the Harvest Church. Klein, in his normal disguise, looked up at the sacred emblem of life on the facade, held his cane, climbed the steps, and stepped through the main door. The first thing he had to do was to confirm the situation. Only by doing this could he perform better so as to ingeniously rescue the vampire, Emlyn White, without garnering suspicion. Then, as a detective who had provided clues, he could receive the gratitude from the White family and gain the applause of an audience. It was bound to be an interesting performance. The Harvest Church wasn't big, as it only had a prayer hall. Klein found a spot by the aisle and looked ahead as he took off his hat. Bishop Yutravsky was preaching. His height of more than 2 meters, and his burly physique, which couldn't be concealed by his loose priest robes, gave off an extreme sense of oppression. However, his expression was one of extreme gentleness, filled with appreciation and gratitude towards life. In front of such a priest, no one dared to cause a ruckus. The few believers quietly listened, occasionally making prayer gestures unique to the Church of Mother Earth. Klein watched carefully, waiting patiently, neither conceited nor rash. As the sermon ended, he gripped his cane and prepared to get up to proceed with his subsequent plans. At this moment, a man wearing the priest robes of the Church of Mother Earth entered from the door that led to the room at the back of the cathedral. He looked 28 or 29 years old, had black hair and red eyes, possessing a high nose and thin lips. He was handsome but didn't give off masculine vibes. He was none other than Emlyn White. Klein's mouth gaped a little and nearly failed to close it. Isn't this guy supposed to be locked up in the basement? Wasn't he shouting about how determined he was, that he would absolutely not submit to Bishop Yutravsky's will? Emlyn White distributed the communion to one believer after another, and he finally stopped in front of Klein. Klein's mind whirred, and he immediately, in a low voice, "Are you Emlyn White? Your parents entrusted my friend to look for you. Why are you here? Did you encounter something? Are you in need of assistance?" Emlyn White didn't seem to have his unique pride and said with a smile that only looked slightly better than crying, "There's no need, I will be returning home soon." He pursed his lips, shook his head, and forced a smile, saying, "I am already a believer of Mother Earth, no, a priest." This answer was completely out of Klein's expectations. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond, and he could only shout repeatedly in his mind, "Hey, you were very adamant about your worship of the moon the last time we interacted at the Harvest Church. You said that you would absolutely not convert to believing in Mother Earth. How long has it been, and you have already given in? Isn't that way too fast? What about your persistence? Where's your moral integrity? My carefully prepared performance has been forced to end before it has even begun. This is just taking me by surprise." Klein opened his mouth and suddenly realized something amiss. Why is Emlyn White informing me of his conversion? I'm just a detective who accidentally chanced upon him while passing by. Does he wish for me to pass this message to his parents? Is there another meaning behind this? While Klein was guessing, Emlyn White put away his worried and smiled smugly. "You don't have to act, Mr. Detective. Or should I call you the new owner of the master key? Hee, to a noble sanguine, everyone has a different smell and has different blood characteristics. Even when I was locked up in the basement, I could smell it. I remember your smell." You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.